0233 hours local, and in a mountain complex in North Korea just over 100 miles from the Chinese border, technicians scramble to remove camouflage netting from the entrance to a deep underground bunker. That bunker has been cut into the mountainside and covered over with camouflage to fool American spy satellites loitering hundreds of miles overhead. The cover of night helps to obfuscate the rush of activity, and the heavy cloud cover is exactly what the Hermit Kingdom was waiting for. Out of the converted mineshaft, a huge truck is carefully backed out. The massive vehicle has only one purpose: to transport the equally massive Hwasong-50 intercontinental ballistic missile. Finally eased out of its hiding hole, the truck begins the laborious process of lifting the giant missile into position. Over 40 feet tall, the missile is taller than a two-floor home and has the power to destroy several square miles of a densely packed city. The launch command officer picks up a phone hardwired straight to an underground telephone line that's connected directly to Kim Jong-un. The North Koreans have to resort to primitive telephone technology to ensure the United States or its allies aren't listening in somehow. On the other end, the North Korean dictator gives a single word. The Hwasong-15 intercontinental ballistic missile fires its main engine, shaking the entire launch complex to its core. Launch personnel hide behind blast screens or huddle inside the relative safety of the launch truck's armored cab, hunkering down in case something goes wrong and the missile and its entire fuel load explodes. 2 seconds later, the missile proves to be in good operation and lifts off the ground. 1,000 miles above the Earth, the United States' space-based infrared system immediately detects the thermal plume of the massive rocket. A low-Earth satellite sends an immediate flash alert to the 2nd Space Warning Squadron at Buckley Air Force Base in Colorado. Brother and sister units across the broad web of U.S. missile defense and the commanders of every U.S. geographical command. A second U.S. satellite in a geostationary orbit confirms the thermal signature of a large ballistic missile and chirps a second emergency alert. The massive Hwasong-15 is nearing supersonic flight and has punched several hundred feet through the clouds and into the open sky. The U.S.'s space-based infrared system satellites have now focused their full attention on the telltale thermal signature of the big rocket. Cloud cover may have made it impossible to see liftoff with the naked eye, but the incredible heat given off by the fiery liftoff was easy to spot by infrared sensors. Now the large rocket is screaming through the air, riding a thermal plume several hundred feet long and thousands of degrees hot. The U.S. satellites immediately begin to compare the thermal signature of the North Korean rocket with a large onboard library of known missile launches. In less than a second, there's a match with 2 different Hwasong-15 test launches from the late 2010s. The confirmed match is immediately sent to U.S. Space Command. U.S. Space Force personnel are stunned by the multiple threat warnings from the space-based network and rush to pour through the data. Humans are far slower than machines though, and it'll take time to verify the threat. The North Korean missile is now twice as high as a commercial airliner, and its main rocket engine is still going strong. Space Force personnel have confirmed the launch as authentic. An emergency flash is dispatched to U.S. forces in South Korea and across the Pacific. It's impossible to know where the missile is headed this early in flight. Via hotline to the DoD and the White House, the alert is out. North Korea has fired a ballistic missile, possibly tipped with a nuclear warhead. The main engine on the Hwasong-15 shuts down as it runs out of fuel. The missile coasts for a brief second, traveling at several thousand miles an hour now in the upper atmosphere, before a series of explosive bolts just under 3/4 of the way up separate the first stage of the rocket from the second stage. A second later, the second stage engine fires, and the vehicle lurches forward as it prepares to exit the Earth's atmosphere. An aide rushes to interrupt a meeting between the President of the United States of America and the leader of a partner nation. There's no time for formalities, and the President is practically dragged out of the room so he can be informed. North Korea has launched a nuclear attack. Target is still unknown. The President immediately heads for the highly restricted and secretive Situation Room in the heart of the White House. From there, he'll be able to communicate with American forces around the world and defend real-time tracking data from various American assets. U.S. Space Command issues an order for radar installations in South Korea and Japan to begin tracking the North Korean launch. Sea-based Spy-1 radars on American naval vessels are networked into the massive surveillance effort tracking the North Korean missile. While boosting into space, the missile is at its most vulnerable, but the United States still lacks its capability to rapidly destroy a missile during this initial phase. With development on high-velocity projectiles and directed energy weapons, it's hoped that in the near future U.S. forces will be able to down a missile during this vulnerable phase. For now, though, all U.S. assets can do is watch and gather data which will help determine where the missile is headed and which missile defense assets to activate. With a nuclear threat confirmed, the United States Secret Service begins preparations to move the president to a secure and highly classified location. If the missile is aimed at the White House, the president has less than 40 minutes to vacate. U.S. terminal high-altitude defense batteries in South Korea, Guam, and Hawaii are activated. Their powerful AN/TPY-2 radars begin sweeping the sky for signs of the threatening missile. Designed to obliterate an incoming ballistic missile during its terminal phase, the batteries of the interceptors are currently useless and can only defend the areas they're assigned to. Patriot missile defense batteries in the U.S. bases across the Pacific go on alert. These too are short-range defenses which are only useful for defending specific locations. U.S. Aegis-equipped warships in the region are given the same alert. Their SM-3 missiles can also be used for short-range ballistic missile intercepts just outside the atmosphere, but require the target to be in its descent stage. With a range of several hundred miles, though, each Aegis-equipped ship can help protect multiple U.S. installations or naval battle groups. The U.S. Northern Command at Peterson Air Force Base begins preparations to activate the United States' homeland defenses. At Fort Greely, Alaska, and Vandenberg Air Force Base in California, the ground-based mid-course defense system is activated, a collection of 44 interceptors. These missiles have a far greater range than either the mobile THAAD or the Navy's SM-3 missiles and are designed to intercept a target in the mid-course before it's had a chance to enter terminal phase and is still cruising through space. More data is needed, however, and all that U.S. forces can currently do is watch and wait. It now has become clear from the missile's trajectory that this is not an attack against forces in South Korea or Guam. Japan is also ruled out as a target. Hawaii remains a likely target, but so does the rest of the U.S. mainland. The U.S. president is notified that based on the missile's trajectory and speed, it is not a test of a new missile. All the data points to this being a legitimate launch against American forces. Given North Korean capabilities, it's likely this is an attack against either Hawaii or the American West Coast. While North Korea has missiles capable of reaching the East Coast, it's not believed they have the targeting capabilities to strike that far with any sort of precision. The president authorizes the use of ground-based interceptors against the incoming threat and order the U.S. Navy ships near Hawaii or the American West Coast to move into positions to best protect major population centers. Across the United States, a fleet of specially modified aircraft put into the air. These big planes are loaded with communications gear and hardened against electromagnetic pulses. They're known as doomsday airplanes because it's their job to ensure that the President of the United States can remain in contact with all U.S. military forces even in the event of a massive nuclear strike against the homeland. The planes will fly high enough to avoid being caught up in destruction below and provide a direct airborne link between each other and surviving space and ground stations across the world. They will not come back down until the crisis is over, with a special fleet of aerial tankers dedicated to keeping them fueled and flying. For the moment, they settle into an orbital pattern across the West Coast, the East Coast, and the American heartland. The full might of the U.S. nuclear triad is officially on alert and prepared to retaliate against any potential threat. With the possibility of another nation using the cover of a North Korean strike to attack the U.S. with its own weapons, America from this point on has to be prepared to fight a nuclear war against any adversary. Troop recall orders are issued for American units across the world, informing soldiers they must drop whatever they're doing and immediately report for duty. Nuclear-capable aircraft are prepared for a possible nuclear mission, and nuclear munitions are prepared for possible loading and launch. Deep in the darkest recesses of the world's oceans, the American nuclear ballistic missile submarine fleet makes its own preparations to rain down apocalypse on the president's command. The second stage of the Hwasong-15 missile runs out of fuel. The payload detaches from the second stage and using a chemical-powered thruster adjusts its course and heading. The missile is now flying unpowered, riding the incredible momentum built by the massive two-stage rocket and moving as much as 4.2 miles a second. U.S. Space Command issues new tracking data on the North Korean missile and confirms separation of the payload from the second stage. Based on this new data, Hawaii is ruled out as a target. Current speed and elevation dictate that a hit on the southern American West Coast is likely. Armed with this new data, U.S. missile defense personnel opt for a GBI launch from Vandenberg Air Force Base instead of Fort Greely in Alaska. 4 of the long, skinny missiles are activated and fed live targeting data, but they can't be launched yet. They must wait until the enemy missile draws closer before launching. The American president is rushed out of the Situation Room and to Marine One, his personal helicopter. 2 attachés join the president. One carries the nuclear football, the remote nuclear command authority unit which gives the president the power to order Armageddon from anywhere in the world. The second carries a large backpack-like communications device that serves to keep the president in contact with all branches of the government and the military at all times. Rather than head to a predetermined shelter, the president opts to instead board Air Force One, believing that there's little risk to a full-blown nuclear attack on the homeland. From Air Force One, he'll be safe from the ground effects of a nuclear blast and be able to remain in contact with the rest of the military and government. U.S. and South Korean special forces stationed in South Korea and Japan are mustered and rushed to armories in preparation for a strike into the north. These elite units have been kept at high readiness due to recent hostilities from the north. Their specially modified Black Hawk helicopters can evade enemy radar and even fly more silently than any other helicopters in the world. They have one mission: infiltrate known North Korean nuclear sites and neutralize them from within. US and South Korean alert aircraft take to the skies in anticipation of a full-blown offensive from the north. On the ground, forces across the DMZ prepare for combat, and an alarm is sounded in Seoul. In case of hostilities, it's expected that North Korea will shell Seoul directly from behind the DMZ and has so many guns that it can deliver a whopping 10,000 rounds of high explosives per minute to the city of 10 million. American supercomputers calculate the trajectory, altitude, and speed of the North Korean warhead and feed that data to the ground-based mid-course defense system. With careful math, the computers calculate a firing solution, and green light is given for the launch of interceptors. 4 GBIs lift off from their silos in the California desert. The missiles will fly not to where the North Korean nuke is, but rather where it will be when they intercept it, with a dumb kinetic warhead that will destroy the enemy nuke through sheer kinetic energy. As they lift into the sky, TPY-2 and sea-based radars are networked together and feed them a steady diet of tracking data. In Guam, Japan, and South Korea, air crews rush to their aircraft in anticipation of full-blown war with North Korea. First up will be F-15s and F-16s to establish air dominance. Normally, stealthy B-2 bombers would slip in behind the air superiority fighters to take out critical air defenses and communications nodes, but the bulk of the B-2 fleet is in Missouri and unprepared for combat. Instead, the Air Force's big stick, the B-52, is prepared for immediate action. These aircraft will require at least an hour to prep, but taking off from bases across the South Pacific will be able to put steel on target within the day. U.S. interceptors are now in space and speeding toward the calculated intercept point with the North Korean warhead. The interceptors have ditched their ascent stages and make only small corrections using chemical thrusters. If the calculated firing solution is bad, they could miss the North Korean warhead by miles. In that case, it'll be up to the Navy's Aegis vessels to down the warhead before it can strike an American city. Updated tracking data reveals the target is likely Los Angeles. The first wave of U.S. Special Operations Forces are given the green light from the American president to take off in their modified Black Hawk helicopters. Their destination is several North Korean nuclear launch facilities believed to be capable of rapid deployment. Other ground attack aircraft based in South Korea are already on their way to their targets, intent on destroying any ability for North Korea to launch a second attack. The U.S. President boards Air Force One. Upon arrival, he asks the United States Congress for a formal declaration of war with North Korea. The North Korean warhead suddenly breaks up into multiple smaller fragments as it ejects a cloud of highly reflective chaff. The metallic confetti is meant to confuse radar systems and make it harder to target the warhead. The warhead is now in 8 pieces. Each piece could be a separate warhead or could be a decoy meant to lure missile defense systems away from the real warhead. U.S. ground and space-based radar struggle to pick out the real warhead from possible decoys from within the threat cloud. TPY-2 and sea-based X-band radars are best suited for this task, and it falls on them now to give a good intercept course for America's GBIs. Powerful processors churn through all the available data to sniff out the real threat from amongst the chaff and decoys. If they fail, millions of people will die. Using extremely precise measurements, the dummy warheads are singled out. Because of North Korea's inexperience with MIRV warheads and the use of decoys, the dummy warheads don't quite match the profile of a real warhead as perfectly as it flies through space. With a good intercept solution, the GBIs detach their exo-atmospheric kill vehicle. It will take 6 minutes for them to reach their target. There's nothing anyone can do now but pray. Unbeknownst to the United States, China has launched its own rapid response forces into North Korea. Elite Chinese troops penetrate North Korean airspace in fast transport helicopters. Their goal is the same as the Americans: seize Kim Jong-un's nuclear arsenal before it can be used again, and thus incur the wrath of the American nuclear triad. With both American and Chinese troops headed to the same objectives, though, this attack now has the possibility of sparking all-out war between the US and China. American EKVs scream through space at over 4,000 miles per hour. They're just seconds from a successful intercept or a catastrophic failure. The first EKV screams past the intercept point, missing the North Korean weapon by a dozen miles. The second EKV hits nothing. It too misses the North Korean warhead by over 3 miles. A second after the second EKV, the third strikes its target true, moving at a combined speed of just under 10,000 miles an hour. The impact produces a bright flash in the sky for a brief second. Nuclear detonation requires a precise chain of events, so the impact of the interceptor does not set off the nuclear explosion. Multiple ground stations and ship-based radar assets all confirm the good news. 2 misses followed by a direct hit. The threat has been neutralized and the dummy warheads will burn up in the atmosphere. The American president receives the good news aboard Air Force One. He can still see Washington, D.C. out the left side of the aircraft. And despite this threat being over, he will not order a return to the White House. The conflict has just begun, and more nuclear attacks are possible at any minute from North Korea. On the ground half a world away, the South Korean and US armies are preparing for what will be the costliest war since World War II, a conflict that will make the original Korean War look like a cap gun shootout. American warplanes are already en route to the Hermit Kingdom, preparing to drop tens of thousands of pounds of high explosives on suspected nuclear sites, and special forces from both the US and China are racing each other to seize Kim Jong-un's nuclear arsenal. On the border, the North Korean army is finally making its opening gambit, and over 1,000 pieces of artillery begin to rain hell down on the South's defenders.
So far in our shows featuring the average person, we focused on Europe and North America. Today we're heading to Asia to compare what could be called a flourishing nation with a country that is usually given the epithet of secret state. The two countries sit side by side, and yet today they share very little in common. One nation is viewed as a threat to Western democratic capitalist values, and the other an ally and exponent of those values. Separated by a demilitarized zone, it's not often that the global public gets to see what happens north of the border. Even when we are given a glimpse inside the secretive nation, we are often told the reality was only a show, propaganda. Today we're going to take a look inside, in this episode of the infographic show, the average North Korean versus the average South Korean. Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell button so that you can be part of our notification squad. According to a fact sheet created by the Korean Economic Institute of America, South Korea's 51 million people are currently living in the 13th largest economy in the world based on purchasing power parity. That number is $1.93 trillion. Its GDP is $1.4 trillion, putting South Korea in 11th place in the world for GDP. North Korea's 25 million people will not be enjoying an economic boon anytime soon. Its GDP, according to the CIA Factbook, was $25 billion in 2015. Some sources say this number is lower. The country's main industries are agriculture, mining, fishing, and the services, while South Korea's major industries cover more modern sectors such as electronics, automotive, shipbuilding, and petrochemicals. What this means in terms of wealth per capita? Well, you can probably figure that out. The average wage in South Korea in 2016, according to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, was just over $32,000 a year. This was taken by calculating the total wage bill in the country by the number of full-time employees. As the North Korean government doesn't publish its salaries, it's hard to know exactly what people get paid. According to North Korean Economy Watch, a high-paid official in the country could earn as much as $1,000 a month. In an article published in NPR, it was said many talented North Koreans working in good factory jobs were earning around $62 per month. It also said the workers were doing relatively okay, and some were earning $100 per month. This is certainly good when compared to the bottom rung of the ladder, with some reports saying many North Koreans earned as little as $2 or $3 a month. If that is the case, how do they survive on such meager wages? For starters, North Korea claims that it is the world's only tax-free country, celebrating Tax Abolition Day on April 1st. Even if that's true, many studies tell us that a large number of North Koreans battle with poverty. A CUNY report stated that much of the population has to live on corn and kimchi and doesn't even have fuel to cook with. The upside, if it can be seen that way, is that all North Korean property is owned by the government. North Koreans are given a place to live, but the condition of that place will depend on what work you do and what rank you hold. Your social status and which part of the country you live in will also factor. This could mean getting a fairly decent apartment or living in a place heated by an open fire that does not have a flushing toilet or reliable electricity. Education is also free, and North Korea says it has a national literacy rate of 100% for children 15 or over. Healthcare is free, although according to various articles, it is lacking. This is because of underfunding, which is partly due to sanctions and a struggling economy. According to one article published in The Guardian, sick people were using crystal meth instead of medical drugs because the former was cheaper and provided a modicum of relief. South Koreans could be said to be breaking good in comparison, but at the same time, more money does often mean more problems. While the Southerners enjoy higher wages, they also have high household debt according to global averages. In a 2017 article in Business Insider, South Korea landed in 7th position on the debt list with 90% household debt to GDP. While working in North Korea doesn't sound like a walk in the park, South Koreans are well known for overworking themselves. According to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the South Koreans worked the second highest number of hours in the world in 2015 at 2,113 hours. This could include 12 hours of obligatory overtime on weekdays and 16 hours on weekends. South Koreans get 16 days of public holidays, one less public holiday than in North Korea. We might also cite a recent Time magazine article that said North Koreans are forced to work 70 days straight to get a day off. Other sources have said they get 15 days off a year. With all that hard work, South Koreans might hope to have good healthcare if they fall ill from overdoing it. That they do with their free-for-all compulsory national health insurance. South Korea also has very modern standards of medical care and highly qualified medical professionals. The system is frequently rated as being one of the best in the world. It can't, however, do anything for a successful suicide. According to the most recent World Health Organization report on global suicide, South Korea was the only developed country in the world to make it onto the top 10 list. Other lists include Japan. Rates differ wherever you look, with some sources putting South Korea in third place in the world, behind North Korea. Most reports don't mention North Korea because there are no verifiable statistics. The rates are rising, and it stands at around 41.7 per 100,000 men in South Korea. This is very high in view of all other developed nations. Many experts say the high expectations of society on sometimes overworked men is to blame. The rate is also high for women, we should add. This also applies to school in the South, where students study notoriously long hours as well as after-school study. For this reason, its students are often in the top leagues globally for their academic performance. 7 out of every 10 high school students in South Korea go to university, but this also means competitiveness and pressure make life hard for youngsters. One report says half of them think about ending it all during their school years. It also means more expensive private schools popping up, while private university semesters can cost anything from $3,000 to $6,000. North Korea's 23,000 colleges and universities are all free. Let's now turn to the body. These two countries should surely have similar looking people, right? Well, some reports say that due to ill health, North Koreans are on average 2 inches or even 3 inches shorter than South Koreans. Outspoken social critic Christopher Hitchens once wrote that it was more like a 5 or 6 inch difference. Men in the South average around 5 feet 8.5 and women about 5 feet 2. The South Koreans are also quite well proportioned and not suffering an obesity crisis like many other developed nations. Men average around 154 pounds and women around 123 pounds. Unlike the paunchy leader Kim Jong-un, most North Koreans are on the lighter side than their southern counterparts. Some reports state that Kim Jong-un gained 88 pounds since becoming leader. As for having fun when not working too hard or prostrating yourself to your most excellent leader, a Guardian article that cited North Korean defectors said that the spirit of umjugamu, meaning the love of drinking, music, and dancing, is alive and well in the North. This is where the two countries can say they still share a similar trait. They both love karaoke and getting wasted on white liquor. Although, said the article, North Koreans do it at home and Southerners tend to go out.
This video was made possible by Wix. If you're ready to create a website, head over to wix.com/go/infographics to try out one of their premium plans right now. Relations between North and South Korea have been rather tense for some time, which might be an understatement. But this year, we saw North Korea's leader, Kim Jong-un, walk over the border to shake hands with South Korea's president, Moon Jae-in. Until then, most South Koreans, and most of the world for that matter, saw the North's head honcho as some kind of evil dictator. After the meeting, some South Koreans referred to him as a cute teddy bear. So, is everything okay now, following handshakes and slaps on the shoulder? Well, even though a third summit has been proposed between the two leaders, right now the North isn't exactly in the USA's good books. South Korea's big brother certainly watches over this relationship like a brooding mother. Let's have a look at how this division started in this episode of the Infographics Show. Why did North and South Korea split? You probably already know that North and South Koreans are very similar in many ways. Even culturally, the language is pretty much exactly the same, except for a few small differences. You could say that North Korea likes to keep the language free from impurities, such as borrowing words from English. But besides regional dialects being slightly different, we can say you speak Korean, not North or South Korean. North and South Korea originally came together in the 7th century under the Silla dynasty, and they remained united up until 1945. So what happened? How could a country united for so long suddenly just split in two? The answer is war, the Second World War. But it's a bit more complicated than that. Prior to the Second World War, there was something called the First Sino-Japanese War, which was a war between China and Japan between 1884 and 1895. Based on the Western industrial model, Japan had become a very powerful country in the 19th century, no longer a backwater, as the members of the British Empire used to call it. Japan emerged as an empire itself. Korea, on the other hand, had been rather fearful of foreigners and Western industrialization, especially the elite that ruled over the country. They didn't want outsiders messing in their business. But then, in 1880, things started to change. Korean diplomats went on a mission to Japan that year. While in Japan, they were presented with a study from a Chinese diplomat which was called A Strategy for Korea. In part, that study warned that the Russians were coming. It also said, "Stay friendly with us, the Chinese, and don't get on the wrong side of Japan." Japan wasn't an immediate threat at that time, but the Chinese diplomat advised the Koreans to stay close with the burgeoning nation. At the same time, Korea was also advised to form good relations with the United States, who also could provide protection from the Russian juggernaut. In 1882, Korea signed a treaty with the US called the Treaty of Peace, Amity, Commerce, and Navigation. So far, so good. Open trade, modern industries, and the bonus of added protection. But there was a catch. The Chinese wanted the treaty to say that Korea belonged to China. The Americans were not keen on that and insisted that Korea was independent. In the end, they agreed that Korea had a kind of independent status but was still a tributary state of China. To cut a long story short, China had a massive influence on Korea and tried to reform the country. That was in line with embracing some Western ideals and using Western technology, so Korea became more modernized to some extent. China just kept pushing and soon was involved in running Korea as well as dispatching its own troops there. We can't spend too much time on this, but the war between the Japanese and China was fought partly in Korea. Japan came out on top, and in 1910 the country annexed the Korean peninsula. From then until the end of the Second World War, Korea was part of the Japanese Empire. This wasn't exactly great news for many Koreans, as some historians say the Japanese treated them like second-class citizens. But then, the war ended, and Japan was on the losing side. What to do with Korea? That was in the hands of the winners, the Allied powers. "No more empire for you," said the Allies to Japan. It was up to the USA to take over the administration side of Korea, but it wasn't keen on the idea of running the country. The Soviet Union was keen and wanted the land it thought it deserved. Russia had lost a war with Japan in the early 20th century called the Russo-Japanese War. That's why the Soviets, to some extent at least, thought they deserved control of Korea. Underdeveloped Korea for so long had been standing between these giants of Japan, China, and Russia, and basically everyone at some point wanted a piece of it, or should we say, all of it. It was actually quite surprising that the Japanese had defeated the Russian Empire, and so perhaps Russia had been left with some egg on its face. After winning wars both against China and Russia, the West knew that Japan certainly was a mightier power, but that ended with its defeat at the hands of the US in the Second World War. Two Americans called Dean Rusk and Charles Bonesteel had the responsibility of making borders in the US-occupied territories in East Asia. They came up with the idea of splitting Korea into two, almost in half, divided by what's called the 38th parallel. This was done without Korea having a word in it. The Americans said that half the country would be run by the Soviets and half by them. Not surprisingly, America got the better half of the cake, which included the more modern city of Seoul. That's not to say the North was an outback. It too had many major heavy industries. The South had the light industries. Soviet leader Joseph Stalin and President Roosevelt agreed to the split, while the Koreans were not even invited to the meeting. Of course, many Koreans were passionately against this, but not those that had ties to the Soviet Communist Party. Actually, at the end of the war, many Koreans from the North and South were over the moon. Finally, they would get their independence back. Brothers in arms, they embraced and planned for the future together. But of course, that didn't happen. Brothers in arms were about to become quarreling siblings. Soviet forces quickly took control from the Japanese forces in the North, and in the South the same happened with the Americans. Easy. Well, not really. The US, as we know, was afraid of the spread of communism as one might fear an outbreak of Ebola. The country didn't even want any of the South Korean political parties to have much say in how the now half country was run, just in case they leaned ever so slightly to the left. As things turned out, the US wanted both North and South to have a democratic government and democratic principles, while the Soviets wanted the entire peninsula to be communist. Now we have a divide of the former two allies, although America had been wary of communism for a long time. The US and Soviet leaders were even supposed to meet in 1948 to discuss the idea of reunifying Korea and leaving the country to its own devices, but both countries were so afraid of the other that this didn't happen. In 1948, the Americans pretty much installed their own idea of a good leader for the South, a staunch anti-communist called Syngman Rhee. The Soviets installed Kim Il-sung as leader. He'd been a fighter in the Red Army and of course was a puppet for the Soviet Empire, as much as Rhee was the puppet for the empire that dare not speak its name, i.e. America. Like Stalin, the North had to be ruled by a godlike character, and a cult of personality was sown into the minds of those Koreans living in the North. You must remember, at this point, the Koreans were still just Koreans. They'd been split in half without any say in it. Of course, many North Koreans weren't on board with such things as supreme leaders and all that attendant propaganda. But if you've read Plato, you'll have heard of the noble lie. Plato said that if the elite must rule, they must tell a huge whopper, create a mythology for the not-so-clever public consumption. Plato said that it was noble because the normal folks need this lie to bring them together under one great myth, just as religion brought people together under one truth. Plato said if the first generation don't buy it, the second will mostly, and you'll have the third completely if you fill their heads with this idea from being children. That's how many North Koreans became so enamored with their godly leader. Well, that and fear. But then, in 1950, Kim Il-sung got ambitious and decided he wanted to rule the whole peninsula. That was the start of a 3-year-long war called the Korean War. The Americans joined the South with other countries of the United Nations, and they defeated the North. 3 million people died, and in the end, nothing at all really changed. Korea was still divided at the 38th parallel. After that, the demilitarized zone was set up to prevent more blood from being spilled, and to prevent people from reuniting or escaping. People did get through though, most of them Northerners trying to get into the South. Both countries, though, soon became enemies, or at least enemies in ideals. The North was strictly communist with its Korean Workers' Party, and the South espoused capitalism, individual freedom, and American values. The Americans have kept bases in Korea since. As you watch this, there are about 28,000 US troops based in South Korea. Will they stay or will they go? Well, you'll have to keep your eyes on the news.
North Korea and South Korea, two countries that one would think are exactly the same, couldn't be more different from one another. In fact, their politics, economies, and cultures are so vastly different that unification between the North and South seems all but impossible these days. We thought it would be interesting to take a closer look at what would happen if the North and South once again took up arms against one another in this episode of the infographic show, North Korea versus South Korea. Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell button so that you can be part of our notification squad. North Korea may be something of a stranger to the developed world, a country purposefully hidden from the prying eyes of the global media, but one thing it doesn't mind us seeing are glimpses of its military strength. The country might only have a small population of just under 25 million, but it's reported that as of 2016, it has around 1,190,000 active military personnel, 600,000 reserves, and a massive 5,889,000 paramilitary force. This makes the Korean People's Army the largest military force on the planet, employing 7,679,000 people, around a quarter of its population. By comparison, it is 2.5 times bigger than that of the most powerful military in the world, the USA. Size isn't everything though, as we will soon see. Considering North Korea's huge number of able fighters, you might not be surprised to learn that South Korea also has one of the largest military forces. As of 2016, the Republic of Korea Armed Forces consists of around 3,725,000 people from its 51.5 million population. 625,000 are active personnel, and 3,100,000 act as reserves. With a military of such numbers, North Korea has to pump 25% of its $40 billion GDP into its defense budget. South Korea has an estimated $2 trillion GDP, of which $36.8 billion is spent on its military. In terms of where the money goes, North Korea lives up to its epithet of the secretive state, and its military arsenal and nuclear capabilities have been a matter of speculation for some time. According to the Federation of American Scientists in 2017, North Korea has an estimated 10 nuclear warheads. Not many compared to the United States' 6,800, but 10 more than its neighboring southern counterpart. It's said that South Korea has the technology to build nuclear weapons, but has so far chosen not to do so. It's also protected by the USA under what is called a nuclear umbrella. In terms of artillery, the North Korean Army has around 6,600 tanks, 4,100 armored fighting vehicles, 2,250 self-propelled guns, 4,300 towed artillery, and 2,400 multiple launch rocket systems. The South Korean Army has 2,654 tanks, 2,660 AFVs, 1,990 SPGs, 5,374 towed artillery, and 214 MLRSs. With the North's huge army and its bigger artillery, it certainly has the advantage on land. It's also worth noting that unlike its prosperous neighbors, North Korea implements a Sunggun policy on its population, meaning that military service comes before everything. South Koreans, on the other hand, enjoy a much less battle-minded society. Maybe this is why the Korean Economic Research Institute said in 2011 that the North would have the edge in the early days if a war should break out. Nonetheless, and in spite of the North's air defense artillery, it has a fairly weak air force compared to South Korea. Of its 940 aircraft, its strongest flying machines are somewhat out of date. Its fleet partly consists of around 40 Mikoyan MiG-29 Fulcrums, 105 MiG-23 Floggers, and 35 Sukhoi Su-25 Frogfoots. These planes may have been at the forefront of military aviation in the 70s and 80s, but technologically speaking, they pale in comparison to today's military aircraft. According to the Pentagon, the majority of Pyongyang's arsenal consists of only vintage machines. The Republic of Korea Air Force is far more advanced. It consists of around 1,500 aircraft, much of which is uber modern compared to its foe. While it's still awaiting an order of 40 F-35 Lightning IIs, possibly the world's most advanced jet fighter designed in the US, it also has a number of F-16 Fighting Falcons, F-15K Strike Eagles, and F-A-50s. Even North Korea's respective anti-aircraft missiles would be hard pushed to defend the country against such aerial might. In terms of naval power, North Korea has again been accused of being completely out of its depth in terms of technology, with most of its fleet being built in the 50s and 60s. While it has a large number of vessels, they would not be a viable threat if conflict should occur. In total, it has 0 aircraft carriers, 4 frigates, 0 destroyers, 6 corvettes, 78 submarines, 528 coastal defense craft, and 23 mine warfares. South Korea, by contrast, has a modern navy with its own shipbuilding industry said to be at the forefront of maritime design. In total, it has 1 aircraft carrier, 12 frigates, 12 destroyers, 16 corvettes, 15 submarines, 70 coastal defense craft, and 11 mine warfares. When it comes to North versus South in the sea, the general conclusion is we should look at quality, not quantity, with most critics stating the technology of both sides is hardly even comparable. A battle must also be fueled, and here both North Korea and South Korea lack the oil for any kind of protracted conflict. The North produces around 100 barrels of oil per day and consumes around 15,000 barrels a day. It has no oil reserves. The South produces around 500 barrels a day, consumes 2,325,000 barrels daily, and also has no proven oil reserves. It's debatable if any country would come to the aid of North Korea if a war should break out with South Korea. The South, on the other hand, has the advantage of the US as an ally, with 30,000 US troops already stationed in South Korea. It's thought that while North Korea's land advantage might get them off to a good start, it would only be a matter of time until the South and its allies took out anti-aircraft missile sites, command and control centers, its land artillery, and finally the country's infrastructure. If the North decided to use its nuclear arsenal, there are 2 things that could happen. Either its population would be decimated by US nuclear missiles, or its nuclear weapons would be captured in a land invasion. Given the vast and deadly consequences of the former, it's likely the latter would be the best option. Ultimately, North Korea, even with its huge number of personnel and some say exaggerated weapons programs, would be no match for South Korea and its main ally, the USA. Such a conflict would be devastating, however, and it's one the world does not want to see. A lot has happened since we last compared the militaries of the USA and North Korea. President Donald Trump and North Korea's Supreme Leader Kim Jong-un have been involved in spats that are both amusing and deeply worrying at the same time. Each leader has issued insults as well as threats. Kim Jong-un famously called Trump a mentally deranged US dotard, while Trump later bragged about the size of his button when compared to his nemesis's button. It all seems quite juvenile, but we might ask how big the threat of conflict really is. After North Korea was accused by the US of being behind the WannaCry cyber attacks, North Korea responded by saying this was just more American propaganda. The quest for truth can be quite exhausting. Today we'll pit these 2 nations against each other again. In this episode of the Infographic Show, USA versus North Korea, updated for 2018. Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell button so that you can be part of our notification squad. We all know that the USA has the largest and most expensive military in the world, but when it comes to North Korea, the country's military arsenal and the power of its missiles is still somewhat speculative as it is a very secretive nation. The USA has the largest GDP in the world at $19.36 trillion. The country spends more on its military than any other nation. The financial website The Balance tells us that for 2018, the US will spend $824.6 billion on defense, which is more than the next 9 nations combined. We are told that $574.5 billion will be spent on the base budget for the Department of Defense, $64.6 billion on overseas contingency operations, and the rest on all the other departments such as Homeland Security and the National Nuclear Security Administration. Certain programs are also very expensive, such as the cost of 70 F-35 Joint Strike Fighters, which will set the USA back $10.3 billion alone. The military will also purchase a bunch of new toys, and they don't come cheap. In 2018, some of this new equipment will be one CVN-78 class aircraft carrier for $4.6 billion, two DDG-51 destroyers for $4 billion, 15 KC-46 tanker strategic military transport aircrafts for $3.1 billion, one B-21 bomber for $2 billion, two Virginia-class submarines for $5.5 billion, 2,647 joint light tactical vehicles for $1.1 billion, and a further $13.2 billion will be spent on science and technology. Most of the new equipment comes with very advanced tech, and systems these days have vastly improved automated processes. All of these obviously come at a cost. North Korea has a tiny economy in comparison. In 2016, it was said the GDP for the country was $28.5 billion, which was 3.9% higher than the year before, according to the BBC. The same report also said that this growth rate was the fastest rate in 17 years. What's quite shocking is how much of this GDP is spent on military, with some media reporting it's as much as 22%. It's thought that spending of late has been about $10 billion. This obviously is more than 22% of the GDP we stated, although some media does say that North Korea's GDP could be as much as $40 billion. Much of this, of course, goes to the upkeep of a massive armed forces, but South Korean analysts also point out that around $1 to $3 billion goes to the country's nuclear program. Still, if we put these things in perspective here, the mighty supercarrier belonging to the USA, the USS Gerald Ford, has an $8 billion price tag, and that's before all the cash is spent on research and development to get the thing working properly. One thing North Korea does have in large numbers is people willing to fight. While all nations use propaganda to compel their citizens to be proud and get them jacked up enough to risk their lives in times of conflict, North Korea has something called Sungun. This is a military-first policy, meaning people must put the military before all other aspects of their lives. The same could not be said to exist in the USA, where most people have grown used to relative freedoms and even, for some, quite a decadent lifestyle. In North Korea, men must serve in the military for at least 10 years, while women serve for 7 years. It's estimated that about 25 million people live in the country, and 6,445,000 are military personnel. Most of these are paramilitary personnel. We should also mention that numerous reports state that North Korean soldiers are depressed and underfed. It's difficult to say for sure, as the opinions of defectors could potentially be biased. The USA is quite different. From its population of nearly 326 million people, 2,363,675 are military personnel. Almost 1 million of those people are reserves. But as you know, the USA has quite the cache of weapons. We won't go through all this again, as not so much has changed since our last show, and you already know what new purchases the USA is about to make. We will say that the USA's 13,762 strong military air fleet is like no other in the world. As well as all those new F-35 Joint Strike Fighters, the country also owns large fleets of other advanced aircraft. This includes fleets of F-22 Raptors, F-15E Strike Eagles, F/A-18EF Super Hornets, and F-16 Fighting Falcons. We can't possibly mention all the rest, but it's a bigger arsenal of military aircraft than any other country by far. North Korea has a lot of equipment, but it's thought much of it is old and nowhere near as advanced as what you'll find in the US Air Force. It's thought the country has around 940 aircraft. This includes 40 Mikoyan MiG-29 Fulcrums, 105 MiG-23 Floggers, and 35 Sukhoi Su-25 Frogfoots. The Pentagon has called Pyongyang's fleet vintage machines. It was reported that the country was interested in purchasing Russia's powerhouse, the Sukhoi Su-35, but it doesn't look like that ever came to fruition. The same goes for land artillery. North Korea has a lot, but it's very old. The USA's aircraft would likely have easy targets, although North Korea has boasted about all its secret underground bunkers and tunnels. According to Global Firepower, the North Korean army has around 6,600 tanks, 4,100 armored fighting vehicles, 2,250 self-propelled guns, 4,300 towed artillery, and 2,400 multiple launch rocket systems. That's a lot of gear, but besides for the USA having a lot more armored fighting vehicles, it's similar to the numbers of artillery the US has. The major difference is the technology. North Korea's machines are largely just leftovers from days gone by, while the US, as we know, is buying new equipment and also owns some of the best tanks in the world, including the very capable M1 Abrams tank. It gets even worse in the water for North Korea, as its navy is arguably its weakest link. The country has 0 aircraft carriers, 4 frigates, 0 destroyers, 6 corvettes, 78 submarines, 528 coastal defense crafts, and 23 mine warfares. In contrast, the US is buying those new destroyers we talked about and also owns those floating islands we call supercarriers. What does this mean? Well, reports tell us that the 3 US Nimitz-class supercarriers floating around the Asia-Pacific region is big trouble for North Korea. The ships are there to show the ability to rapidly consolidate joint forces in response to a regional contingency, according to the US. Apparently, the focus was on North Korea. Finally, we come to nuclear capabilities, which is possibly North Korea's strongest asset after its large and possibly unshakable personnel force. Along with Russia, we know that the USA has the largest cache of nuclear warheads in the world. This is about 9,600 in total. If you saw our show on North Korea's missiles, you'll know the country now claims it can hit anywhere in the world. Analysts are not so sure, but some do think the country's Hwasong-14 missile could be capable of reaching the USA. It's thought the country has about 20 large nuclear warheads in total, but the problem is launching them. Some analysts believe this is still a big problem for North Korea. The country also has a lot of shorter range, less powerful missiles, but those could cause a lot of destruction closer to its borders. Nonetheless, the Washington Post reported in 2017 that even if North Korea did fire a missile at the USA, a $40 billion defense system would destroy it on its way. This is called the Ground-Based Mid-Course Defense System, or GMD. First, the rocket carrying the missile is detected, and when that happens, the GMD gets ready. Apparently, it would take about 30 minutes for a missile to reach the US from North Korea. While the missile is in the mid-course phase outside of the atmosphere, it would be intercepted, or so the game plan goes. Others have said such tech should come second after trying to improve the diplomatic mess between the two countries. Amen to that.
It's a rumble in the jungle, a showdown on the 38th parallel. The Hermit Kingdom of North Korea versus the United States of America. Kim Jong-un versus, well, we're not really sure who because this script was written before the presidential election. It's the American bald eagle versus the North Korean, trash pigeon? That doesn't really seem like North Korea has an official national animal. It's a showdown the world's been expecting for decades. But how do these two antagonist powers stack up? Who really has the advantage in a showdown on the Korean peninsula? For this scenario, let's compare the two countries alone, and without the help of allies, to see how they really measure up against each other. Overall, the United States is ranked as the world's #1 military power, and currently the only global superpower. It's a common mistake to call Russia or China superpowers, but the definition of a superpower is a state that can exert economic, cultural, and military influence worldwide. Currently, the US is the only nation with the military fleets and cultural and economic clout to do so. North Korea is no slouch, though, in the military department, and despite being a financially destitute hermit kingdom, it's managed to field a military that places it at the number 25 spot in global rankings. This is because most of the official budget of the North Korean government goes to its military, and the military also receives hundreds of millions in covert financing, typically the result of state-sponsored criminal enterprises. In terms of manpower, the United States fields an active duty force of 1.4 million personnel versus North Korea's 1.28 million. The US also fields a greater force of reservists, with 860,000 personnel versus North Korea's reserve force of 600,000. The US barely has the numbers advantage here, but in a grueling multi-year conflict, the US has the population advantage, with 4.2 million reaching service age every year versus North Korea's measly 415,000. If North Korea wants to win, clearly it has to secure victory as quickly as possible. Wars cost money, though, and it turns out it's an extremely expensive affair. The latest US defense budget is about $750 billion versus North Korea's $1.6 billion. This, of course, is only the official government figure, and North Korea's real defense budget is easily hundreds of millions greater thanks to all that black market activity. Remember, kids, doing drugs may seem tubular, but you're just gonna help North Korea go nuclear. But let's check out all the toys that those big budgets buy. In the air, the US fields 13,264 aircraft versus North Korea's 949. Not only is this a massive numbers disparity, but a huge disparity in capabilities as well. The US currently relies on the F-15 Eagle and the F-18 Super Hornet as its primary air defense and air attack platforms. These two aircraft are fourth-generation models, but have received serious upgrades to their capabilities, which boost them into a fourth-and-a-half-generation capability. Complementing U.S. fighter forces are 187 F-22s, the world's only fully operational fifth-generation fighter, and officially the world's deadliest fighter aircraft. As more and more F-35s come online, however, and achieve initial operational capability status, the entire U.S. fighter fleet is poised to become fully fifth-generation, a significant battlefield advantage against any foe. North Korean air forces are decades behind the US in capability. Its most numerous fighter aircraft, the Chengdu J-7, was developed in the 1960s and exported by China. Its most capable aircraft, the MiG-29, was deployed in the 70s as a counter to the American F-15. However, North Korea's MiG-29s number at only 35, and it's believed that they lack anything resembling modern avionics. To make matters worse, North Korea's entire inventory of air-to-air missiles herald back to the Cold War, and the nation possesses less than 500 of them. An air battle between the US and North Korea would be hopeless for the Hermit Kingdom, which is why its pilots are trained in kamikaze tactics. If war were to break out, North Korea's Air Force would launch one-way attacks across the DMZ, knowing its Air Force could never survive an air war. In the mountainous terrain of North Korea, perhaps no aircraft is more important, however, than the attack helicopter. Capable of taking out armored forces and providing recon and fire support in places regular aircraft would find it difficult to operate, attack helicopters would be of paramount importance in a showdown between the two countries. The U.S. fields an inventory of 967 Apache helicopters, one of the deadliest attack helos ever built. Not only is each Apache equipped with state-of-the-art electronics and sensors, but these agile birds are extremely tough to boot. When an entire flight of Apaches was ambushed in a protracted battle against insurgents on the ground in Afghanistan, the U.S. famously only lost a single bird while decimating ground forces below them. North Korea's 20 attack helos are Soviet-built MiG-24 Hinds, an extremely capable attack helicopter that, despite being dated, still packs an impressive punch. Good thing for the U.S. ground forces that North Korea only operates a small amount of these powerful Russian birds of prey. On the ground, North Korea is almost neck and neck with the U.S. in terms of armored forces, with 6,045 combat tanks versus the U.S.'s 6,289. The two tank armies are almost evenly matched in terms of numbers. In terms of quality, though, well, North Korea once more suffers greatly. North Korea's most formidable tank is a native upgrade to the Soviet T-62, known as Chonmahol, with the T-62 being North Korea's most numerous, nearly modern design. Large numbers of them were upgraded with new armor, fire and sighting systems, and other sensors. In effect, these might be upgraded designs, but the core model is still the 1960s-era T-62. It's known that North Korea operates at least 1,000 of these tanks, but may have upwards of 1,200. North Korea's second most prolific tank is the T-54 and T-55, of which it operates 2,000. These dated, underpowered tanks were terrifying when first fielded by the Soviet Union in the 50s. But as Iraq found out in the first Gulf War, present absolutely zero threat to the U.S. modern Abrams. On the ground, North Korea's tank forces simply could not hope to do more than delay an American armored advance. One area where North Korea rises above the U.S., though, is in the size of its rocket artillery forces, fielding 2,110 versus the U.S.'s 1,366. Rocket artillery may not have the endurance of fire of traditional artillery, but provides one extremely crucial advantage over regular artillery. By firing all of its munitions in extremely rapid succession, rocket artillery puts all of its steel on target within seconds, giving troops and vehicles little time to seek cover. While the U.S. fields more modern versions of rocket projectors, the technology is so simple that even North Korea's Soviet-era technology poses a significant and deadly threat to U.S. forces. On the seas, the U.S. fields a fleet of 490 ships versus North Korea's 984. North Korea may seem to have an advantage in numbers, but that's because the vast majority of its ships are small torpedo boats that can't operate far from shore. The second largest element of North Korea's navy is its underwater forces, with one of the world's largest submarine forces numbering anywhere between 60 and 80. 40 of these subs are the medium-sized diesel-electric Sango class, built in the late 90s. While not particularly advanced versus the U.S. Navy's Los Angeles and Virginia-class nuclear submarines, diesel-electric submarines used in a defensive posture close to the shore can be an incredibly effective force, even if technologically outclassed. By loitering near the shore and running silently on battery power, North Korea could simply choose to have these subs lie in wait for oncoming U.S. ships and launch deadly ambushes. The nation's willingness to operate these craft in a kamikaze style similar to its Air Force only adds to the deadliness of North Korea's submarine force. By comparison, the U.S. operates 66 submarines, most of which are Los Angeles-class attack submarines. These are in the process of being phased out by the new Virginia class, which incorporates many of the Seawolf-class technologies at a lower cost and thus with less effectiveness than the deadly Seawolf, which is sadly far too expensive to field in large numbers. 3 of the legendary Seawolf-class submarines remain in service with the Navy, with no near-term plans to retire them, though the Navy is planning on acquiring a new modern variant of the Seawolf to use on extremely important or sensitive missions. With 20 aircraft carriers, which include smaller carriers meant to support amphibious operations, the US is guaranteed to have air power anywhere in the world it needs it. By comparison, North Korea has 0 aircraft carriers and could not hope to ever operate one in its current economic climate, let alone ensure it survives first contact against US forces. Despite all these naval advantages to the US, though, North Korea once more has the advantage in one area: mine warfare. With 23 vessels especially equipped to mine sea lanes versus the US's 11, North Korea is poised to make an amphibious attack against it by the superior US fleet a costly affair in terms of manpower and equipment. Clearing sea mines is an extremely time-consuming and dangerous affair, and with so many mine-laying ships, North Korea could make entire beaches and ports completely inaccessible to US forces. The military advantage is clearly in favor of the US, but a showdown between the two countries is far more nuanced than merely comparing numbers. The US must maintain global commitments even during a war, meaning that it wouldn't be able to commit more than 30 to 40% of its total force to a conflict with North Korea. That brings the number parity way down on the US side, though the US's far superior equipment and training, or force multipliers, practically ensure a US victory. However, it would be an extremely costly victory for the US and its allies, as North Korea is well prepared to make a push north from South Korea an exceedingly bloody affair. With its mine-laying capabilities, the North Korean Navy could make the ocean around the Korean peninsula inaccessible for weeks, disrupting not just military operations, but civilian traffic as well, and shutting down one of the busiest trade arteries in the world. Then there's North Korea's nuclear program, the full extent of which is still not known. What is clear is that North Korea has the materials and technology for several bombs. Some estimates place the current North Korean stockpile at 30 to 40 weapons. Even though most of these weapons could reach the US mainland, they would make any conflict on the peninsula an extremely dangerous affair, with a losing Kim Jong-un likely to decide to use nuclear weapons against US forces and South Korea, rather than be deposed as so many dictators before him. It's May 1951 and the Korean War has been raging for a year. The world is still weary from the ravages of World War II, and the United States is the only nation capable of leading a UN response to the attempts by the Communist North to seize South Korea and unify the peninsula by force. The conflict has set the stage for a defining age in human history, the Cold War, and soon a regiment of American soldiers will find that curious visitors from another world may also be interested in how this war plays out. The Americans are 60 miles north of Seoul. The jungle is thick and oppressively hot. The North Koreans have been pushed back from South Korea in a brilliant pincer movement carried out by US forces. Rather than risk being destroyed completely, North Korea forces quickly retreated into the north, as US-led NATO troops attempted to encircle them with an amphibious landing in the north. Despite these military successes, though, the troops are nervous. At every sunrise, every man on the front lines has one question on their lips: have the Soviets joined the war? Have we finally started World War III? Private First Class Francis P. Wall and his platoon are providing security for an attachment of artillery, which is itself preparing to rain down fire on a village full of North Korean forces. Men watch the jungle around them cautiously, despite being a few miles from the official front. Raiding parties against the American artillery are not uncommon. The artillery is set to fire just before dawn, and the villagers below have all been warned of the impending attack and told to flee. As the hour approaches, the big guns begin opening up. Artillery shells whiz through the air, bursting just above the village and showering the North Korean troops below with deadly shrapnel. The thunderous booms echo across the hills as a dozen guns open up one by one and deliver death to the enemy. Suddenly, though, Private Wall and other men responsible for providing security for the artillery see something in the hills above the village. It seems that the bombardment has attracted the attention of something none of the men will ever be able to explain. The light is dim at first, but quickly grows in brightness as it moves down the jungle hill. To the Americans, it appears like a floating jack-o'-lantern, emitting some kind of light from its body that is at first orange in color. To their shock, the light moves just over the village, even as the American artillery continues to pour fire into it. The air-bursting shells detonate all around it, and then the light does something incredible. In a move that defies all known physics, the light is able to rapidly move to the side of an exploding shell, avoiding being directly hit by the rounds. Even avoiding a direct hit, the object, which by now the men know must be some sort of craft, must have some sort of protective shielding, as it's still being showered by frag from the exploding artillery shells. Even if it is receiving any damage though, the Americans on the ground are unable to tell and simply watch in awe for almost an hour as the craft weathers the bombardment of the village. Then, the craft turns its sights on the Americans. With no warning, the craft turns in place and now moves directly toward the American position. The men are nervous. Nothing in their training has prepared them for this. Is it a secret Soviet craft, perhaps based on stolen Nazi technology? The speculation runs wild as the men prepare for what might be an attack on their position. Private Wall asks his company commander for permission to fire on the object as it approaches, using his M1 rifle loaded with armor-piercing rounds. His company commander agrees, and as the object approaches still bathed in orange light, Wall and his squad mates open up. Their fire is accurate and the craft comes under fire from several rifles. If the craft was employing some sort of protective shielding against the artillery shrapnel blast, it must have dropped it because the men are able to clearly hear the metallic sides of the craft ringing out from the sounds of their bullets striking it. As the men fire, a few of the armor-piercing rounds must have found their mark, piercing the strange craft. Suddenly, the craft goes wild. The lights begin flickering on and off erratically, and the craft makes crazy sporadic movements from side to side. At one point though, the craft remains floating in the air above the GIs. The lights go completely off, but then seems to flicker back to life. The Americans on the ground, worried that the craft is going to either explode or come crashing down on their heads. Then, the craft seems to regain its stability, and suddenly the mountain valley is filled with the unbearable sound of what seem to be dozens of diesel train locomotives starting up all at once. The craft begins pulsing bluish light and attacks the soldiers below. As the men watch helplessly, the craft sweeps a ray across the battlefield below it. The brightly colored ray seems to come in pulses that the men can only see when it sweeps directly over them. Like car headlights or a searchlight in the dark, the craft sweeps this ray across the ground below it, seeking out soldiers where they lay in their fighting positions. As it sweeps over each man, they're racked with a burning, tingling sensation all over their flesh. The company commander immediately shouts for his men to take shelter from their bunkers. Small dugouts reinforced with plywood and sandbags. The bunkers offer protection for their men from the artillery bombardments, and the soldiers dive below the ground to take shelter from the mysterious ray. From inside these bunkers, the soldiers are able to watch the craft through small peepholes. Some of them even start returning fire from small firing slits. The craft suddenly blasts the entire area with a bright light, turning night into day briefly. Perhaps frustrated by the men safely out of its grasp in their bunkers, the craft then pulses with light once more and without warning shoots off at a 45-degree angle. To the astonishment of Private Wall, the craft seems to fly off at impossible speed, quickly being lost to the starry night sky. Lingering in their bunkers, it's a few minutes before the men work up the courage to leave the safety they offer. The company commander quickly calls for a meeting, and to a man, the soldiers all agree on one thing. They aren't telling a soul about what they just experienced. While each day the company is expected to file a report on its activities for the day, the company commander agrees it's best to leave this one off the books for now, for fear that they'll all be thought of as crazy. At the time, there's no such thing as UFOs in the public consciousness, and while mysterious stories of World War II Foo Fighters circulate through the military, nobody has yet made the link between their appearances and otherworldly alien visitors. Better then to keep everyone's mouth shut so they don't end up locked up in the loony bin. However, a few days later, the men of the 25th Infantry Division, 27th Regiment, 2nd Battalion, Easy Company start to fall ill. They're nauseous, they have terrible headaches and diarrhea. So many of them are affected at once that the army has to cut a road through the jungle to send ambulances and evacuate many of them. When doctors examine them, they find the men have extremely high counts of white blood cells and seem to be suffering from dysentery. After the war, Private Wall would struggle with PTSD and drop from 180 pounds to 136. The weight loss would be permanent, and the private would struggle all his life with weight issues as he struggled to recover to his normal weight. An official explanation for the event was never given, and with no official report filed, an investigation was never conducted. Whatever the men saw that night in Korea, though, was not a one-time incident, as GIs all across the conflict would tell very similar stories. For years, the mysterious craft are thought to possibly be Soviet secret weapons, but when those weapons never materialized in Soviet arsenals, the men involved would be forced to look for more otherworldly explanations. As the Cold War came to an end, it was revealed that on the other side of the Iron Curtain, the Soviets were also encountering strange alien craft. Some even alleged that the Soviet military had been involved in a conflict with underwater alien beings. According to allegedly secret documents leaked by former Soviet intelligence officials turned whistleblowers, military divers encountered a strange being in a silvery diving suit with a bubble-like helmet. When they returned to the area later to try and capture it with a net, the divers were forcibly sent upwards toward the surface by an invisible force. Their quick ascension from 50 meters down gave many of the men the bends. However, others argue that UFO sightings in wartime in Korea or even during the Cold War were nothing more than simply the effects of severe stress on the human brain, with both sides acutely aware that a full-scale global war could erupt at any time. Plus, with the stress of normal combat, the mind may play tricks on some people, even creating outright hallucinations. Plus, as some have pointed out, the symptoms that Private Well described are similar to regular dysentery. Whatever the truth is, wartime UFO sightings are nothing new, and the Korean War is seen by many as the floodgate opening up to what would become a full-blown alien incursion of planet Earth. Perhaps this isn't as surprising as it might seem though. After all, this was just years after the United States developed a working nuclear weapon, propelling humanity into the atomic age. And shortly after, the world found itself in the grip of a potentially civilization-destroying Cold War. Could aliens have been interested in how this part of human history played out? If reports from Korea are true, the answer may be a very frightful yes.
This year has been chaotic to say the least, particularly in terms of enmity between certain countries and the possible fallout of that bad blood. At the end of October, news outlets published Japan's defense minister stating that North Korea's nuclear and conventional weapons program was at a critical and imminent level. This came after a spat between US President Donald Trump and North Korean leader Kim Jong-un, in which the latter called the former a mentally deranged US dotard, only for Trump to respond with the threat of total destruction. Many of us are wondering just how serious these threats are. While comedians joke about the spat and numerous amusing memes appear online, many of us are mulling over the possibility of nuclear destruction. And so, it's only fitting that today we are comparing two countries involved in the ongoing verbal conflict in this episode of the infographic show, Japan versus North Korea. Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell button so that you can be part of a notification squad. We'll start with North Korea, a country that has a population of around 25 million. In spite of there not being that many North Koreans, less than the population of Tokyo's metropolitan area, a staggering 7,679,000 people are ready to fight if called on. It is the largest military in the world in terms of personnel. 5,889,000 people act as a paramilitary force, while 1,190,000 are active military personnel and 600,000 are reserves. Exact numbers differ according to different sources, but all agree that the country's emphasis of military first, known as Sogun, is real enough. According to Newsweek in 2017, all North Korean adults are conscripted when they are 17, men must serve 10 years, and women around 7. Those that get a place at university can do their time in the military after university, and certain scholars can get out early. Newsweek claims science students may only have to serve 3 years. In comparison, Japan's military is very small in terms of personnel. The country has around 250,000 active military personnel, with another 57,900 people acting as reserve personnel. Japan does not have military conscription. The question we might ask here is, what's more important, the size of your military or what you do with it? According to Forbes in 2017, Japan is the 8th biggest spender on defense at around $46.1 billion. This is around 1% of Japan's GDP, although it was reported in 2017 that this 1% spending cap will soon be scrapped. As for North Korea, it's reported that the country spends a massive 22% of its GDP on its military, which is around $10 billion. Another thing is, we really don't know how much the country spends, as it's famously or infamously a very secretive nation. As an Amnesty International East Asia researcher put it in 2017, the size and capability of the military are virtually impossible to verify, but the huge commitment to nuclear capability means citizens suffer in other areas of life. Other areas of life might suffer, but so do the country's soldiers, according to The Guardian. The newspaper wrote in 2015 that many North Korean soldiers survive on a few potatoes a day, and if they don't die in service, they often become very weak. North Korea may be the worst place in the world to do military service, said the story, and if that is true, it is something we cannot ignore when we compare militaries. On the other hand, most media outlets in the West state that Japan's military is one of the best trained in the world. So, you decide. Does size matter? Let's now have a look at what each military has in terms of firepower. According to Global Firepower, the North Korean army has around 6,600 tanks, 4,100 armored fighting vehicles, 2,250 self-propelled guns, 4,300 towed artillery, and 2,400 multiple launch rocket systems. This is a lot of land artillery, which was mainly built up throughout the Cold War. Attacking North Korea by land, analysts agree, would be no small feat due to its numerous hardened artillery sites, or HARTs, which are equipped with a lot of weapons. Conversely, National Interest published an article in 2017 doubting the strength of North Korea's large tank force. This includes old Soviet T-55s and Chinese variant Type 59s. It also includes the better North Korean-designed Chonma-ho, although pundits don't see this as a threat to other modern battle tanks. Japan has some of the best machines on Caterpillar tracks. Its full land force consists of 678 tanks, 2,850 armored fighting vehicles, 202 self-propelled guns, 500 towed artillery, and 99 multiple launch rocket systems. This includes the Japanese-made Type 10 main battle tank and Type 90 main battle tank. In the air, Japan has the advantage again, employing in its air force some of the most modern aircraft ever created. Not surprisingly, as Japan is one of the USA's closest allies, Japan likes to shop in the US arms store. Japan owns the highly touted, but not always in battle condition, American-made F-35 Lightning II. The country just has one at the moment, but another 42 have been ordered. Japan also has a large fleet of American F-4 Phantom IIs and F-15 Eagles, as well as its homemade and very advanced Mitsubishi F-2. Unless North Korea has a trick up its secret sleeve, Japan has a much more ferocious air force. The somewhat dated 940 aircraft in the North Korean Air Force is left wanting. The fleet consists of 40 Mikoyan MiG-29 Fulcrums, 105 MiG-23 Floggers, and 35 Sukhoi Su-25 Frogfoots. In the water, pundits say a similar thing again regarding North Korea, that its machines are outdated and the fleet is in need of a total overhaul. This aging fleet consists of 0 aircraft carriers, 4 frigates, 0 destroyers, 6 corvettes, 78 submarines, 528 coastal defense crafts, and 23 mine warfares. Japan has the upper hand again, with 1 aircraft carrier, 35 destroyers, 51 frigates, 35 corvettes, 31 mine warfare, 3 amphibious transports, 8 nuclear attack submarines, and around 50 conventional attack submarines. According to military analysts, Japan's Aegis-class guided missile destroyer alone is a force to be reckoned with. This brings us to missiles. What exactly does North Korea have, and what are the capabilities of its missiles and missile launchers? Well, we've discussed this in depth in another show, and to be frank, the world is not exactly sure what North Korea is capable of. We know the country is perfecting its missile launches, having launched 22 missiles in 15 tests since February 2017. That included the 4th of July launch of an intercontinental ballistic missile to show the world its missiles could reach practically anywhere. The USA is a target, as North Koreans believe the US wants to remove the country's leader and free the people from what it deems an oppressive form of government. Japan certainly has more to worry about being so close, but still no one knows exactly how many nuclear weapons North Korea has. Japan doesn't have its own nuclear weapons, although of late, defense policymakers have said perhaps it's time to put US weapons on Japanese soil. The US already knows Japan is no slouch, with a professor of military history at the US Army Command and General Staff College saying in 2017 that pilot for pilot, ship for ship, Japan can stand toe-to-toe with anybody. US Defense Secretary James Mattis has also vowed to stand behind Japan and South Korea, stating in September this year, "We are not looking to the total annihilation of a country, namely North Korea, but," he added, "we have many options to do so." This support from the US makes a huge difference if anything should ever happen between Japan and North Korea, but let's hope it doesn't. In previous shows, we've covered the secretive state of North Korea, but more along the lines of who's running the place and what kind of military might the country boasts. Today's show will be quite different. People defect from North Korea quite often, and even as we write this, in today's news, Bloomberg published a piece featuring videos of defectors describing what life was like for them before they got out. In fact, since 1953, it's reported that somewhere between 100,000 and 300,000 North Koreans have escaped the country, with 31,000, almost 3/4 of which are women, now legally registered in South Korea. China and Russia house most of the rest of the defectors. But how do you secretly get out or even in? That's what we'll find out today, in this episode of the Infographic Show, how to break in and out of North Korea. The most popular escape route is into China, where defectors jump the border mostly in the provinces of Jilin and Liaoning. This is risky business to say the least, because with China being a big trading partner of North Korea, it doesn't exactly help hide defectors. In fact, if defectors are caught, they won't be given refugee status and will be sent back to North Korea. There, the escapees will no doubt suffer harsh punishment in political prison camps. Many of the defectors will try and make their way to South Korea, where a home most likely awaits. One girl named Ellie Cha was just 19 when she escaped to China. While her father had once been a successful mining boss in North Korea, her aunt escaped, which didn't look too good for the family left behind. So they decided to defect. She told the Western media that hardly any defectors try and get straight into South Korea as it's just too dangerous. Cha and her family did what many illegal border runners do around the world and paid brokers to assist them in their dangerous travels. One by one, they crossed the Chinese border and had to stay the first 2 nights in the mountains as their transport didn't turn up. They then traveled secretly through China, fearing they might get caught and turned back, to cross the border to Vietnam. But things took a turn for the worse when they were arrested by Vietnamese police, spent 6 nights in jail, and were sent back to the Chinese border. Speaking about her father at that time, she said he collapsed onto his knees and said, "Please, please, for the kids, for the children." Back in China, they spent months trying to find a place where they were safe, then tried to cross into Laos, Myanmar, and finally Thailand. In Thailand, they lived in a refugee camp, and from there they finally got in touch with South Korean authorities who helped them. Thailand is the go-to destination for some North Koreans, as the country will send the defectors to South Korea, not the North. So the Chinese route isn't exactly easy for most, but it's the best bet by a mile. What about the Russian route? The Russian land border with North Korea is tiny at just 11 miles long. Compare that with the 880-mile border between China and North Korea. There is one way across by land, and that's going over the Friendship Bridge over the Tumen River. Still, it's thought that thousands of North Koreans have escaped using this route. We should mention that it's also a perilous route because North Korea and Russia signed a treaty in 2014 stating that anyone found illegally entering either country will be repatriated. In 2017, news broke about one man who had escaped to Russia and lived there for 20 years. He was arrested and is about to be sent back. As it's pretty much impossible to sneak through this border, the majority of the estimated 10,000 defectors living in Russia are said to have escaped from work camps. So, Russia is not really an option unless you have been sent there to work some terrible job. What about crossing one of the most heavily militarized borders in the world, the DMZ or Demilitarized Zone dividing North Korea and South Korea? Surely this would be suicide. Well, you might remember the North Korean soldier in 2017 that did just that. The man basically ran for his life. He was shot 5 times by North Korean soldiers, but news reports tell us he survived and is now in South Korea. Reports state that after his escape, he was in critical condition in a South Korean intensive care unit. In a twist of fate, it turned out that the man had committed a murder in North Korea, though the nature of the crime is unclear, and he could have faced the death penalty. While thousands choose China, hardly anyone tries this crazy stunt. It's thought that 2 defectors successfully crossed the DMZ in 2017 besides the soldier we just mentioned, but there have only been another 5 since 2012. So in short, defectors are very unlikely to escape through Russia unless they have been sent there to work. Getting through the DMZ will more than likely get you shot to pieces. China is the escape route of choice, but you better hope you have transport connections and can make it out of the country, either to a kind place in Southeast Asia or all the way to a hospitable Western nation. You could also just stay in China, of course, and take your chances there. Okay, sneaking in. First of all, Western tourists can visit North Korea, it just has to be through a select few private tour agencies. You can't just rock up to the border, cross over, get on Tinder, and hit the city for a few beers. While most of these tours only allowed you to go to the capital of Pyongyang in the past, reports state that other parts of North Korea are now opening up to tourists. We found one tour company that said it is easy, just get your visa and join a tour and you're on your way. The US put a travel ban on North Korea though, and South Koreans and Malaysians also can't get in. You'll be departing from either Russia or China. For 7 nights, traveling alone, with flights into the country from China and just about everything else paid for, will set you back about $3,000. Most blogs we can find writing about travel to North Korea said it was a good experience and not what they expected. But one journalist who pretended to be a university lecturer said it was strange indeed, like something from a Franz Kafka novel. He said, however, it was safe for foreigners. He said he sneaked in, but what he really meant was he got in using an alias in terms of his profession. Journalists and writers are apparently not on North Korea's most welcome list. Has anyone really properly snuck in? According to Business Insider, plenty of Americans have tried. One man in 1996 tried to cross the Yalu River between China and North Korea. He was caught and sentenced to a few months in prison. On returning to the US not long after, he was said to have died of a self-inflicted gunshot wound. Another American man ripped up his visa and just stayed. He was caught and got 6 years for it. Some attempts have been made by US soldiers on the border that for some reason wanted to get in, with one particular man apparently falling for a North Korean beauty. In fact, the latest case of an American trying to cross into North Korea illegally was in 2017. He was caught too, trying to get in from the civilian control line just below the DMZ. It seems the Americans are the ones who really want to get into North Korea illegally. They're just not doing a good job of it. Another way, as Shane Smith of Vice magazine found out, is to get to the Chinese border and bribe some officials. It's much less dangerous than swimming across rivers. He managed to get all the documents and made a documentary about his visit. South Koreans with sympathies for the North have tried too, mostly via the swimming tactic or even walking across a frozen river. But all in all, if you really want to sneak into North Korea, your best bet would likely be bribes or do what those defectors do and cross somewhere secretly on the Chinese border. If you are European looking, or perhaps African, it's likely you'll stand out. We suggest you don't bother trying, as it's very likely you won't be welcomed with open arms.
If you've ever wondered what it would be like to have unlimited wealth and power, you're definitely not alone. Who hasn't dreamed of living like an all-powerful leader, with endless wealth surrounded by people catering to your every whim? To find out what it's really like to live like the wealthy dictator, supreme leader of an isolated hermit kingdom, let's take a look at how rich Kim Jong-un actually is, and how North Korea's dear leader really spends his fortune. The secretive nation of North Korea is home to 25 million citizens who for the most part live in extreme poverty and isolation. The average North Korean only earns around $2,000 a year, and it's estimated that upwards of 40% of the population is severely undernourished. It's no secret that Kim Jong-un is the richest man in North Korea, but exactly how rich is he? Well, that's a difficult question to answer. North Korea is often referred to as a hermit kingdom because of how isolated and cut off from the rest of the world the country is. The leaders of North Korea control every detail of their citizens' lives, including the media and internet access, so getting accurate information about the secretive country is difficult, to say the least. No official estimates of Kim Jong-un's wealth exist, so he was excluded from the Forbes list of the world's richest people. However, Forbes did list him as the 36th most powerful man in the world, since he has absolute control over his country and his people. In 2013, a joint South Korean and American investigation set out to determine exactly how much Kim Jong-un is worth. Based on what little information they could scrape together after months of tireless research, they determined that Kim Jong-un has a net worth of at least $5 billion, hidden away under false names in secret foreign bank accounts in places like Austria, Switzerland, Russia, and Liechtenstein, just to name a few. The bulk of his fortune appears to be held in China, where many accounts with millions of dollars in cash in them can be traced back to the supreme leader and his family. If the estimate is right, a $5 billion net worth would rank him near number 320 on the Forbes list of the world's richest people, alongside some of the world's most successful financiers and media moguls. Kim Jong-un was certainly born into a rich and powerful family, but he never expected to have the level of wealth and power that he now enjoys. As the second son of his father, previous Supreme Leader Kim Jong-il, his older brother Kim Jong-chol was favored to be the next leader of North Korea. But all that changed when Kim Jong-chol was caught trying to enter Japan with a false passport. He claimed that he simply wanted to visit Disneyland in Tokyo, but the damage was done. He had embarrassed the North Korean regime, and his position as favorite son went to his younger brother Kim Jong-un, who many considered to be a carbon copy of his father. Kim Jong-un also had another half-brother, Kim Jong-nam, who had enjoyed his father's favor for a few years. This must have made him a threat in Kim Jong-un's eyes, because after he came to power, Kim Jong-nam was attacked with a nerve agent at a Malaysian airport and assassinated in 2017. So now that Kim Jong-un has secured his hold on his unlimited power and wealth, how does he actually go about spending his fortune? Does he spend it on improving the lives of his people and bringing North Korea out of the dark ages? No. Kim Jong-un was raised in a lifestyle of luxury, and his tastes have only gotten more exorbitant since he took power. Kim Jong-un attended high school at a Swiss boarding school under a false name, and that may be where he developed his penchant for luxury watches. According to some sources, Kim Jong-un has a personal watch collection worth more than $8 million. Kim and his wife are often seen wearing expensive watches, and he frequently uses luxury timepieces as gifts for high-ranking party members. In recent years, though, Kim has had trouble getting his fix of luxury watches from Switzerland, after the UN banned the export of luxury goods to North Korea in reaction to their nuclear program. Former schoolmates of Kim Jong-un, who knew him back then as Pak-un, the son of an embassy worker, also remember his obsession with basketball. Apparently, basketball is a family tradition. Kim's father, Kim Jong-il, was a huge Chicago Bulls fan, and he even tried unsuccessfully to arrange for Bulls superstar Michael Jordan to visit the Hermit Kingdom during his reign. Kim Jong-un must have felt like he was living a childhood dream come true in 2013 when basketball legend and Hall of Famer Dennis Rodman made his first visit to North Korea. The controversial star has been back to North Korea many times since and has called himself a friend for life of the supreme leader. While upwards of 40% of the population of North Korea is undernourished, Kim Jong-un enjoys stuffing himself full of the finest food from around the world. It's estimated that he spends millions of dollars a year feeding himself and his innermost circle with the world's best cuisine. Kim favors the finest quality pork from Denmark, black Iranian caviar, Japanese Kobe beef, and fresh melons from China, all while his people subsist on a meager diet of rice and kimchi. Another habit he picked up from boarding school in Switzerland was an obsession with cheese. According to some inside sources, Kim's diet consists almost completely of cheese, and that he's been known to make himself so sick that he's had to take breaks from public life after gorging himself on shipments of Emmentaler cheese from Switzerland. Some believe he's intentionally trying to fatten up to look more like his grandfather Kim Il-sung, the much revered and rotund first supreme leader of North Korea. In a country where most people are starving, a full figure is seen as a symbol of wealth, and his weight gain might be meant to signal to his people that Kim is so rich he can afford to eat himself to death. Kim Jong-un may have inherited his love of food from his father as well. In 1997, Kim Jong-il hired the first Italian chef in North Korea, strictly to make pizza for the ruling family and their elite circles. Both Kim and his father were said to go crazy for pizza covered in meat, ham, pepperoni, prosciutto, and they ate it all up. No fine dining experience would be complete without a drink to wash all that rich food down. And of course, Kim Jong-un has the finest tastes in drinks too. He reportedly spends nearly $30 million a year importing Hennessy whiskey and the world's finest champagnes to pair with his pizza and cheese. He also spends nearly $1 million a year importing the finest Brazilian coffee. And of course, Kim Jong-un can't truly enjoy the world's fine coffee and most expensive liquors without a luxury cigarette. Kim, an avid smoker, is said to prefer imported French cigarettes that cost nearly $50 a pack and carries them in a $165 couture case. His love of cigarettes is so deep, in fact, that the investigators who looked into his finances back in 2013 are convinced that a huge portion of Kim Jong-un's wealth comes from the manufacturing of illegal drugs and cigarettes. Kim seems to have no reservations about building his fortune in the black market. Experts also estimate that North Korea makes at least $15 million a year from counterfeit currencies, and the UN estimates that North Korea hackers have stolen more than $2 billion from the global financial system. Kim Jong-un has no trouble spending away the results of his regime's nefarious activities, and his diet is just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to his outrageous spending. In 2012, human rights organizations put pressure on world leaders to stop exporting luxury goods to North Korea, while its people continued to starve. The official regime had been spending nearly $650 million each year on imported luxuries like exotic pets, electronics, and perfumes for its elites, while its people continued to live in utter poverty. Kim Jong-un is without a doubt the main beneficiary of the regime's lavish spending. Although he rarely leaves his hermit kingdom in North Korea, the supreme leader travels around his domain in style. He owns more than 100 luxury cars, including an armored Rolls-Royce Phantom 7 worth at least $500,000, and a collection of more than 30 Mercedes-Benz that he inherited from his father. His father was a Mercedes-Benz aficionado, and his favorite vehicle was the S600 Pullman Guard limousine, an armored limo that can withstand full metal jacket bullets and grenades and comes with a cool $1.5 million price tag. Kim is also rumored to have an Audi R8 V10 first generation. One of these highly desirable supercars was confirmed to be included in a shipment of 42 Audis from China to North Korea, and it could only have been meant for one man in the entire country, and that's just his personal fleet. As an absolute leader of North Korea, Kim Jong-un also owns the nation's military fleet, with vehicles like the 9-axle transport erector launcher capable of carrying and launching North Korea's most powerful missiles. For longer trips, like his January 2019 trip to celebrate his birthday in China, Kim Jong-un travels in first-class style on board his personal armored train. After boarding the train via a red carpeted ramp, Kim can relax in plush pink leather chairs, sip some French wine, and nibble on some Swiss cheese. Or he can dictate orders to his minions from his onboard conference table and work on his secret plans on one of the many onboard Apple computers. And of course, an onboard chef is on hand to satisfy the supreme leader's slightest craving, serving up a menu of cuisines from around the world on demand. As if a bulletproof train in a fleet of luxury cars wasn't enough, Kim Jong-un also has his own private plane, a $1.5 million decades-old Soviet-made jetliner nicknamed Air Force Un. To top it all off, he also owns one of the finest luxury yachts, a $7 million, 200-foot-long floating pleasure palace that Dennis Rodman called a cross between a ferry and a Disney boat. With all the luxury transportation options you could dream of at his fingertips, Kim Jong-un is able to travel in style between 17-plus luxury homes and estates around the country. His main home is a nuclear attack-proof estate called the Central Luxury Mansion, located in the capital of Pyongyang and complete with its own underground train station. When he needs to kick back and relax, Kim can spend some time at the world-class luxury ski resort he ordered to be built shortly after he took power. Or he can spend some time on his private island, which has its own shooting range and theater. Dennis Rodman spent time on Kim's Island during his 2013 visit and called it a 7-star party lifestyle full of the best food, booze, and luxuries the world has to offer. When it comes to the strangest ways that Kim Jong-un chooses to blow his fortune though, it might just have to be his collection of thoroughbred racehorses, which he uses extensively in his propaganda photos. Kim Jong-un has reportedly spent more than $500,000 importing horses since he's rose to power. While Kim Jong-un has introduced a few reforms during his reign, and he does project a more laid-back persona than his father and grandfather did, he definitely has a dark side. He appears to have systematically executed anyone he considers a threat to his power, including his own brother and uncle. And while the North Korean people starve, their dear leader goes on spending hundreds of millions of dollars a year on fine food and other luxuries. I guess no one ever told him that great power comes with great responsibility. The bloodiest conflict of the 21st century starts out quiet enough. A few dozen street cleaners across Seoul go about their business, spraying pesticide and disinfectant spray on the sidewalks and bushes around the most popular and important businesses and cultural sites of Seoul. There are a few people out early this morning, and the sun's just starting to rise. But within 2 hours, the South Korean capital will be swarming with almost 10 million people and an additional 1 million tourists. By noon, 500,000 will be dead. The street cleaners are North Korean agents who snuck across the border months ago, loaded up with backpacks and sprayers full of various chemical and biological agents. Going about their business largely ignored by authorities, the sprayers have infected several square kilometers of one of Asia's most important cities, and the highly contagious agents have reached millions of people in the span of a few hours. The chemical agents are more immediately lethal nerve agents, which target the brain's ability to send signals to the various organs in the body. Hundreds of thousands seize up, paralyzed, and unable to breathe as they slowly asphyxiate. Medical services are immediately overwhelmed and far too late to save most victims. The biological agents the North Korean sleeper agents have spread across Seoul will take longer to take their toll. These include anthrax, hemorrhagic fever, yellow fever, smallpox, and plague. Highly virulent, those affected will spread diseases across the rest of the population, and in days, the death toll will reach in the millions. The attack on Seoul is repeated across South Korea's major cities, especially Busan, a strategic important city for the U.S. defense of South Korea. Agents attempt to infect U.S. and South Korean bases, but these have environmental systems which immediately alert authorities to the attack. It's not enough to stop all casualties, but it does severely limit the effects of the attack. By the time it's obvious that North Korea has struck the first blow, the second terrible blow falls square on Seoul itself. Hundreds of long-range guns open up on the South Korean capital from behind the demilitarized zone. They're joined by over 1,000 rocket projectors, creating a literal rain of steel that falls down on the densely populated city. Every minute, an astonishing 10,000 high-explosive rounds fall in the city. These casualties are immediate and immense, with nearly 1 million people dying in the first hour of the attack. But not all of those incoming rounds are conventional. Thousands of VX gas munitions explode in the skies all over Seoul, spreading the incredibly lethal agent throughout the city. Long-range missiles loaded up with VX, smallpox, and other biological agents are fired by the hundreds at other South Korean cities and military bases. The U.S. bases of Osan and Kunsan come under direct attack from conventional, chemical, and biological weapons. But U.S.-made Patriot missile batteries succeed in destroying many of the older generation missiles targeting those critically important bases. A few manage to slip through, but the damage is limited by the fact that U.S. troops are vaccinated against anthrax, smallpox, and various other biological agents. South Korean forces, however, are not, and attacks against the South Korean military are far more deadly. U.S. and South Korean warplanes are attempting to take to the air, but North Korean special forces have launched daring raids against most major airfields. At Osan and Kunsan, the North Korean Special Forces soldiers launched suicidal raids against the American planes stationed there. U.S. security forces manage a robust defense, but the attacks still managed to destroy or damage many high-value American aircraft, and even more importantly, slow down air operations significantly. With planes in the air within minutes of the shelling of Seoul, though, an immediate hunt for North Korea's deadliest weapons is on. American and South Korean warplanes scream across the border and into North Korea. American and South Korean F-15s and F-16s clash with waves of antiquated North Korean MiGs. It's a complete turkey shoot for the American and South Korean air forces, but the sheer number of defenders slow them from their ultimate objective, the destruction of North Korea's nuclear weapons. From Japan and operational bases in South Korea, American special forces are being rushed to the north with one job: seize North Korean nuclear sites before the weapons stored there can be used. But they're not the only ones trying to get to North Korea's nukes. China has been monitoring the situation in the Korean peninsula closely, and for a few years has had an elite cadre of special forces deployed near its border with the North. At the outbreak of hostilities, Chinese special forces board helicopters and fly at full speed toward their former ally. The orders are simple and clear: seize North Korea's nuclear weapons before they can be used, and kill any who stand in their way. But does that include American special forces attempting to do the same thing? Nobody knows, but what is clear is that with most of North Korea's nuclear sites within 60 miles of its border with China, the Chinese will likely get there first. But those efforts are moot at the moment as a dozen long-range ballistic missiles lift off from launch pads in the mountainous north. The world holds its breath as the missiles streak up and into the sky, breaking through the atmosphere. It was once believed that Kim Jong-un would only use nuclear weapons as a last resort, but recently it's become clear he was willing to use them in the opening stages of a conflict. His gambit is simple: force the United States to rethink its willingness to defend South Korea. To achieve his goals, the missiles are aimed at the American air bases in Ulsan and Kunsang, and the port city of Busan, and several other South Korean cities. A final missile is aimed straight at the U.S.'s base in Guam. Despite having the capability of striking at the U.S. homeland, Kim Jong-un has decided not to. An explicit message to the American president: is he willing to trade Los Angeles for Seoul by defending South Korea in this war? American terminal high-altitude defense systems target the North Korean missiles in their terminal phase, while offshore Aegis-equipped South Korean and American destroyers lend their own missile defense support. Working in tandem, the missile defense of the South manages to stop 8 of the missiles. 4 hit their mark. The American air base in Ulsan goes up in nuclear fire, as does the port city of Busan and 2 other metropolitan centers. The missile aimed at Guam is intercepted by the island fortress's robust missile defenses, but the message is clear: Kim is willing to use nukes against distant American targets, to include the homeland. The loss of Busan is especially damaging for the U.S.'s plans to defend the South. The port city is the only major port where the U.S. would be able to disembark the large number of troops and combat material needed to defeat the North. While the U.S. has 30,000 troops in South Korea, it's estimated that it will need at least 200,000 to end the threat of the Kim regime once and for all. Even as the North's nuclear missiles are falling in the South, the air war against North Korea has already devastated much of its nuclear infrastructure and command and control nodes. Despite this, fully eliminating North Korea's nuclear capabilities will require a ground invasion with conventional forces, even with special operations forces inserted into the north within hours of the conflict starting in earnest. These American troops have run into stiff resistance from North Korean defenders, and in some places have made contact with Chinese special forces that beat them there. Washington is perfectly fine with Beijing gaining control of North Korea's nukes, so a conflict between the two sides is averted. However, North Korea has prepared to defend its nuclear weapons from both China and the U.S., and not all insertions to seize its nuclear sites have gone to plan. American and Chinese units have been completely decimated at several key locations, overwhelmed by North Korean defenders. After a blistering barrage of nuclear, chemical, and biological attacks against military facilities and civilian targets alike, air operations are having difficulty meeting the sortie rates required to check the North Korean advance across the DMZ. The United States is surging air forces from Japan into the battle, and everyone's surprised Japan has officially joined the fight. Its long-range strike capabilities are quite limited though, and instead for now the Japanese Air Force aids in establishing air superiority and providing close air support for ground units engaged in fierce combat. The North's forces have poured across the minefields and barricades of the DMZ like a massive human wave. The casualties have absolutely been staggering, but with well over 1 million men to throw at the South, those losses have been easily absorbed by the gargantuan North Korean military. American and South Korean border units fight fiercely, but are overwhelmed by the unrelenting assault. The mass concentration of North Korean artillery has suffered significant losses during its shelling of Seoul to counter battery fire and airstrikes. But the sheer number of guns deployed by the North still give it blistering firepower with which to batter the South's defenders. Losses along the South's line units are incredible, and despite having superior equipment, training, and firepower, the South's much smaller army is being steadily pushed back towards Seoul by the end of the first day of fighting. Night slows down the North's advance, as many of its troops and vehicles lack night vision equipment or thermal imaging. Now is the chance for the South to strike back, and U.S. and South Korean attack helicopters and armor units launch a brutal counterattack against the North's forces. The U.S. only operates a token force of tanks in South Korea, about 50 at any one time, but the big Abrams easily outmatch and outgun any of the Cold War-era tanks the North has to offer. Fighting alongside South Korean K-2 tanks, despite being vastly outnumbered, the South's defenders inflict catastrophic losses on the North over a night of firefighting. It's not enough, and thanks to its massive artillery forces, the North manages to inflict large losses of its own on the American and South Korean armor units. The bombing of North Korea has been non-stop since the beginning of the conflict. Massive American B-52s drop hundreds of thousands of pounds of ordnance on the North's advance into the South. but flying from bases in Japan and Guam, their sortie rates are very low. Additional B-52s and B-1s are being surged from the US mainland and European theater, but they'll likely take a few days to be operational. B-2 stealth bombers, however, have been flying from the US mainland overnight, refueled by aerial tankers. They slip through North Korean radar en route to deliver surgical strikes against North Korean political and military targets. Armed with massive ground-penetrating bunker-buster munitions, the B-2s deliver a crippling strike on key North Korean facilities. But the plan to decapitate the North Korean government with one swift strike fails. Kim Jong-un has survived the attack, and intelligence is spotty on where exactly the North Korean leader is. Notably, though, the B-2s are not armed with nuclear weapons. It seems, despite the threat to Guam and successful strikes against a U.S. airbase in South Korean cities, the United States is not willing to escalate up the nuclear ladder. With the aid of U.S. air power, the South's forces are able to halt the North Korean advance just past Seoul. The once vibrant capital is now a post-apocalyptic wasteland, with millions dead in the streets and most of its infrastructure utterly destroyed by a bombardment the scale of which has never been seen in human history. Millions more have survived and are now in desperate need of food, water, and medical care, but the North is not interested in meeting the needs of a captured civilian population. Instead, in order to prevent the spread of diseases they themselves infected the city with, a brutal quarantine has been put into effect around every entry port into the city, and any violators immediately shot on sight and their bodies burned. The international community requests that the North Korean government allow humanitarian flights into the city to treat survivors and evacuate the population, but with China now considered a mortal enemy of the Kim regime, there is no nation with the logistical capability to undertake such a massive operation that the North isn't at war with or trusts. The survivors of Seoul have now become a bargaining chip for the North, which demands reunification with the South, but under its own terms. The situation is dicey for the democratic South, to say the least. While its forces, backed by massive amounts of American air and naval power, have checked the North's advance into their country, they're unable to push them back across the border. The plan was always for the South to act as a blocking force against the North long enough for the United States to surge combat troops into the nation. But with the port facilities at Busan devastated and other ports contaminated by biological or chemical attack, the offloading of large numbers of American troops and equipment, a proposition that would have normally required 6 weeks, will now take months. It could be as much as 4 months before the U.S. has enough forces in theater to drive the North out. The survivors of Seoul will not last 4 months. Within 3 weeks, uncontaminated food and water supplies will have run out, and disease will have killed tens of thousands more. In 2 months, the several million survivors trapped by North Korean forces will all be dead. American combat troops are even now being loaded into their fleet transport ships as air transport surge small amounts of forces into the country. But the ultimate choice is on the surviving South Korean government. Are they really willing to commit 5 million survivors in Seoul to death as they wait for their American allies? And are they willing to risk further nuclear attacks now that it's become clear the United States will not use nuclear weapons of its own in defense of South Korea?
In earlier shows, we compared the North Korean military with the giant of the United States military and the military of its neighbor, South Korea. The secretive state came out looking rather meager in terms of defense capabilities anyway, but just how capable is North Korea if it were to make use of its growing stockpile of missiles? Or, what is the likelihood of that happening anytime soon? Since the armistice was signed between North and South Korea, a certain amount of animus has existed between the two nations. Separated by what's known as the Demilitarized Zone, or the DMZ, this close proximity has imposed years of insecurity on South Korea and to some extent stoked fears worldwide. Is this insecurity justified, or has it been, in part, a sensation fueled by media exaggeration? That's what we intend to find out in this episode of the infographic show, How Far Can North Korean Missiles Go? Don't forget to subscribe and click the bell button so that you can be part of our notification squad. First of all, for those of you who might need to sharpen your geography skills, we'll give you some pointers as to where some countries stand on the map with North Korea. The buffer zone of the DMZ stretches for about 160 miles along the North and South Korean border. The 2.5-mile wide zone, called the most dangerous border in the world, is only 35 miles from South Korea's capital, Seoul. The DMZ consists of guard towers, a patchwork of landmines, and thousands of soldiers, including US soldiers. The country also shares an 880-mile long border with China and a short 11-mile land border with Russia. The Chinese border has been called North Korea's lifeline to the outside world, while the Russian border still doesn't have roads for car or pedestrian travel. There is a train that goes between the two nations though. Pyongyang, North Korea's capital city, is situated roughly 500 miles from Beijing, 799 miles from Tokyo, 6,700 miles from Washington, D.C., 5,397 miles from London, 2,940 miles from New Delhi, 10,790 miles from Brasilia, 5,166 miles from Cairo, and 5,348 miles from Australia's capital, Canberra. By land or by Sea, the state that is often referred to as a kind of boogeyman nation, is quite a trek from those nations which seem to fear it the most, besides, of course, South Korea. Nonetheless, a missile doesn't care about long, arduous journeys. If North Korea has one country outside of South Korea that it paints as its most uncompromising villain, it is, without any doubt, the United States of America. Americans should have nothing to fear given the size of their military and defense capabilities, but also bearing in mind the huge distance that separates the nations. Well, news reports surfaced on the 4th of July this year that North Korea had boasted that it now has bargaining power with the USA. The ace in its hand is the development of a new intercontinental ballistic missile that could potentially reach the US mainland. The North Korean announcement caused quite a fuss as most Americans were busy celebrating their independence from their now best friend, the UK, with Donald Trump taking to Twitter and exclaiming, "Let's end this nonsense once and for all." North Korean news said the country was now a strong nuclear power state, adding that it had a very powerful ICBM that can strike any place in the world. Propaganda or serious threat? The missile causing this media hullabaloo is called the Hwasong-14. What we know about it, or what we think we know about it, is derived from watching it being tested and what the North Korean media says. According to the state media, a recent test saw the missile flying for a period of 39 minutes, reaching 1,741 miles in altitude and traveling for a total of 580 miles. That's not far enough to reach the USA, although analysts believe the missile is capable of traveling for around 5,100 miles, which is almost far enough to reach the west coast of America. Los Angeles lies about 5,800 miles from North Korea, although Hawaii and Alaska are much closer. At the moment, analysts are uncertain if the ICBM is capable of carrying a nuclear payload, but the recent July 4th celebration inside North Korea has without a doubt turned some heads. Almost immediately after the Korean threat was posed, the US said it was prepared for any kind of attack. What kind of nuclear threat does North Korea actually pose? Don't most of the nukes, the usable ones anyway, belong to the US and Russia? North Korea carried out its first nuclear test in 2006, and its latest was in September 2016. This year, North Korea's vice foreign minister said, "We've got a powerful nuclear deterrent already in our hands." Indeed, it's estimated that North Korea has around 20 nuclear bombs, although how far they are capable of being launched has remained somewhat unclear. If the latest news about the ICBM is correct, North Korea could potentially launch a nuclear strike not only against the USA, but throughout Asia, most of Europe, and the Middle East. Its bombs, most analysts agree, have about half the destructive power of those that hit Japan. However, in 2016, North Korea said it had conducted a hydrogen bomb, or H-bomb, test. This was largely discredited, but scary enough given that these bombs are about 50 to 100 times more powerful than those that hit Hiroshima and Nagasaki. North Korea is also said to be packing other long-distance missiles, one being the K908 or Hwasong-13. Its potential is not yet fully understood, and according to US military sources, launching the missile has met with a series of failures. Let's just say if it can do what it is supposed to do, and that is travel for more than 3,400 miles, then this gives North Korea the ability to hit most of Asia. But, and it's a big but, analysts disagree about how far it can go, what propels it, and if it can even carry a nuclear payload. With all this speculation, you might rightly be feeling confused, but don't worry, even the experts are confused. It's fairly certain that North Korea has about 50 intermediate-range ballistic missiles, or IRBMs, which are said to be capable of reaching distances of around 2,000 miles, enough to devastate Hong Kong and pretty much destroy the US territory of Guam and its military base there. One such missile is the Musudan. The Korean Central News Agency described such a missile as being able to carry a large-size heavy nuclear warhead. Again, most of Asia could take the brunt of such a weapon if it were to carry a nuclear payload. The same goes for the Taepodong-2, a missile used for launching satellites, but with the potential of carrying a nuclear warhead for a distance of anywhere between 2,500 miles and 4,000 miles. This brings Europe back into the danger zone. North Korea has quite a cache of much smaller missiles, one of which is the funny-sounding Nodong missile. The Nodong, which according to some reports was partly designed by Russian and Chinese scientists, is a medium-range ballistic missile. It's capable of carrying a nuclear warhead, chemical weapons, and high explosives. It only has around an 800-mile range, but of course that won't make nearby countries feel any more comfortable, especially as North Korea has about 300 of them. This number is also said to be fewer than 50, it just depends on who's doing the guessing. Even smaller are North Korea's road-mobile, liquid-propellant ballistic missiles, or SRBMs, which are definitely operational. This includes the Hwasong 5, 6, and 7. All are capable of carrying high explosives or chemical weapons anywhere from 180 to 600 miles. So far this year, North Korea has fired 17 missiles during 11 tests, each missile having a different range. Present leader Kim Jong-un has been quite trigger-happy since he came to power in 2011, firing off more missiles than anyone in North Korean history. The most in 1 year was 24 in 2016.
Rolls-Royces, the latest iPad, and purses? The things the US won't allow Kim Jong-un and the rest of North Korea to buy might leave you scratching your head. North Korea has been under sanctions for a long time, starting in the 1950s during the Korean War. The communist government, ruled by the Kim family since its founding, has never been recognized by its neighbor to the south, and the peninsula has been in a constant state of tension. After bombings in the 1980s against South Korean targets, the United States tightened the sanctions and declared North Korea a sponsor of terror. But surprisingly, South Korea wasn't always on board, and their liberal government called for engagement. But that was about to change in an explosive way. While Bill Clinton signed the bill in 1994 lessening the sanctions, the country ramped up its nuclear program. In 2003, they withdrew from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and began conducting nuclear tests. This time, the sanctions would be international, passed by the UN Security Council. While they originally focused on weapons-related items, they were expanded to luxury goods and financial assets, as well as restricting the travel of top North Korean officials. The goal was to take away the comforts that the regime was used to and make them more likely to come to the table. Easier said than done. It was 2018, and the Trump administration was hoping to improve diplomatic conditions between the U.S. and North Korea. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo visited the isolated country to press Kim Jong-un to give up his country's nuclear weapons and liberalize the country. Instead, the veteran diplomat got in-your-face proof that the latest ruler of the country was violating the sanctions. He was riding around in a custom Rolls-Royce Phantom limousine, one of the many luxury brands that aren't allowed to do business with North Korea. So, how easy is it to get around international sanctions? It's not easy, but it's far from impossible. UN official Hugh Griffiths had been tracking North Korea's business dealings around the world for years, tracking all their violations. Most of the violations were in hard-to-track resources like petroleum, as well as in currency transfers that allowed them to make purchases clandestinely. But a Rolls-Royce was something else entirely. This was a large, visible purchase that could only come from one source, one that knew better than to deal directly with the regime. And officials worried that if they could sneak in a luxury car, they could sneak in anything. Doing business with North Korea is tricky. Not only are businesses hesitant to send representatives to a country where one wrong move could land you in prison, but violating the sanctions could land you in serious trouble back home. First, you've got to have a license to even buy from them. Not that the Hermit Kingdom has many exports. While there isn't a blanket trade restriction on the country like there is on other nations in conflict with the US, there are a lot of regulations to follow. First, about 100 individuals and companies have been specifically banned from trade due to their links to banned activities. And even if you're not violating these, be careful what you sell. The US and European Union both have lists of goods that can't be sold to the isolated country. This includes items as obvious as weapons and energy supplies that might boost their nuclear program, and as random as expensive cigars. Many vehicles are banned from sale as well, not just cars like the mysterious Rolls-Royce, but including the luxury yachts plutocrats love to sail around on. Certain electronics like computers are banned as well, possibly for security reasons, as access could help Kim Jong-un's cyber experts target major systems, but the banned items also include high-end handbags and even caviar. Bad news for any fish with tasty eggs within North Korea's borders. Of course, the fact that these items are banned from sale in North Korea only means that when they get smuggled into the country, they become a huge status symbol. If you thought rocking that new Gucci bag was a big flex, imagine rocking it in a country where it's literally against international law to sell one. And there are several other stumbling blocks along the way. People who want to trade with North Korea may be able to do it legally, but they won't be encouraged. The federal government has programs for loans to fund trade deals, but organizations like the Export-Import Bank won't participate if the seller is looking to do business with a Marxist-Leninist state. North Korea also doesn't have much spare money lying around that we know of, so overall trade with the country remains very low. In 2012, there was only $12 million worth of trade to North Korea, compared to a massive $39 billion to South Korea, a country with twice its population. But just because the sanctions are in place doesn't mean everyone follows them. The United Nations requires member nations to report on their trade to North Korea. But this isn't regulated as strictly as you might think. With 195 UN member states and observer states, a majority of them haven't filed the proper reports on their trade with the Hermit Kingdom. Maybe some don't even have any, and there isn't anything to report. But for others, they may be trying to cover up some dirty little secrets. North Korea is getting supplies from somewhere, and the world is starting to look a little closer. And most people are looking in the direction of one country. China has long been playing both sides of the fence when it comes to North Korea. The Asian juggernaut has one of only two borders with North Korea, and the only one that isn't heavily militarized. The countries have a mutual aid and cooperation treaty and regular diplomatic relations, although North Korea's nuclear program has caused serious tension. But not serious enough to stop China from being North Korea's top trade partner. In 2009 alone, China sold $136 million in luxury goods to their neighbor. including banned goods like tobacco, electronics, and vehicles. But how do they get away with it in the face of the international sanctions? Where does a bear go first in a town? Anywhere it wants to. China is a powerful and influential country, and they've had several brushes with international pressure. They provide a significant portion of trade to most countries on Earth, including the US, and sanctioning them for violating North Korean sanctions could backfire if they take their business elsewhere. And the ban on luxury goods in the UN sanctions doesn't list exactly what they are. It leaves that up to each country, so there's no way to police exactly what China sells to North Korea, as long as it isn't something actively dangerous like weapons. But even beyond China, North Korea is finding a way. It's estimated that the Hermit Kingdom spends over $500 million importing luxury goods every year. So where do they get their money, and how do they get them into the borders? The answer is usually with a lot more steps. When it comes to importing vital energy supplies like coal and petroleum, which are strictly capped to stop the country from using them on weapons programs, the country usually gets them offshore. By doing transfers of petroleum and coal on the open seas, the country keeps the transfers from being logged against their yearly limits. The ships then head back to home base and unload while flying the North Korean flag. And there's another big way they skirt sanctions: shell corporations. These are companies that exist only on paper. They don't have an office or even employees, which means they're extremely hard to trace if they commit any illegal activities. They usually have a bank account and own assets, which can be seized if they get caught in the act. But this is normally a write-off for a larger and more powerful company. There's no higher level to sanction or punish no matter what they do. This is why shell companies are often clandestinely set up through third parties for some of the most powerful people and companies in the world. And when it comes to getting around sanctions, there is no better way. The most common purposes for shell companies include tax evasion and money laundering, as well as hiding assets from lawsuits or an angry ex-wife. But companies could easily still pass their luxury goods from the main company to a hard-to-trace shell company to another one until it reaches North Korea and Kim Jong-un finally gets to enjoy that caviar he's been craving. With no paper trail between the original seller and the company that finally delivers it, it's one of the best ways to get away with an illegal transaction. But if that transaction's a little too visible, watch out. When Kim Jong-un arrived at the summit in his flashy Rolls-Royce limo, it wasn't just a nice ride, it was a blatant admission that he was violating the sanctions and he didn't care if the US and UN knew it. It was also a prominent luxury item that could be immediately identified, and was a massive black eye for the company behind the high-end cars and limos, BMW. The German corporation was under a lot of pressure to explain how one of their cars wound up behind North Korean borders in violation of international sanctions. The problem was, no one was sure if they even knew. Luxury goods change hands often, and the limousine might have fallen out of the parent company's hands long ago. The images were public, and investigators quickly looked over the limousine for any indicators of how it got there. They had previously traced another limousine in North Korea back to the Chinese businessman who sold it and started cracking down on the smuggling ring that delivered it. They hoped to duplicate the same success here, but North Korea had gotten better at covering its tracks. This was big business after all. The car was worth almost $500,000, and the investigators weren't going to get any answers out of the reclusive leader. They were able to identify that it was in fact an authentic Rolls-Royce limo, and went to the manufacturer, but the company was tight-lipped, either not wanting to admit any liability or not wanting to admit that their security had let this slip by. They were only willing to give some information about when the limo could have been made, between 2012 and 2017, and then they clammed up about further details. Was BMW in bed with the North Korean government? In the past, the UN officials had quizzed other companies about how their cars wound up in the Hermit Kingdom, and the answers led the authorities to large smuggling rings. While punishing governments, especially powerful ones like China, for violating the sanctions can be near impossible, it's a lot easier to nab small fish who make the smuggling rings work. And with those guys facing lengthy prison terms, they're often willing to flip on who's pulling the strings behind the scenes. But for that mystery Rolls-Royce, a lot of questions are unanswered. The company has failed to give the UN its vehicle ID number, and the investigation is stalled. It seems the Kim's taste in luxury cars hasn't gotten any cheaper. Not long after the Rolls-Royce, he was seen riding around Pyongyang in an armored Mercedes. So the pipeline is still going strong, as Kim Jong-un snubs his nose at the international sanctions and demonstrates to the world that they might be able to keep him from importing things above board, but they can't ruin his champagne tastes. Even as North Korea suffers from widespread food and electricity shortages, smuggling keeps its leader in luxury. But reports from within the kingdom indicate that even powerful government agencies might be struggling to find the money they need to keep operating. As the sanctions work, those looking for a connection to the outside world will turn to back channels. After all, there's money to be made, and where there's an opportunity, the smugglers will find a way.
Well,
What would happen if an American soldier and a North Korean soldier found themselves face to face on the field of battle? Who would win? It would most likely come down to the soldier with the best training and equipment. Both soldiers would be well versed in combat, but who would have an edge? Let's compare an American Army soldier to a North Korean soldier from head to toe and see who might have the upper hand. Becoming a soldier is different in every country, but the path to becoming a soldier in the United States versus in North Korea are two totally different ends of the spectrum. In the United States, you can talk to a recruiter who will take you under their wing for enlistment. You're allowed to ask questions, and the recruiter is happy to discuss joining the Army in person, over the phone, or in email. The process is easy but informative. This way, you can find out if the Army is right for you. The antithesis of this process is joining the North Korean military. Every North Korean citizen must join the military. It is not optional. The US may have the most powerful military in the world, but no one is forced to serve at this moment in time. The same cannot be said for the Korean People's Army. If you're born in North Korea, you better believe at some point you'll be a soldier. After being recruited into the US Army, the soldier goes through basic combat training. All soldiers must go through this process. In the training, they learn the basics of survival and teamwork. American soldiers are put through scenarios in real-life combat situations. They must pass physical and mental challenges that will allow them to complete missions in any type of hostile environment. The American soldier is trained by veterans and military personnel who are equipped to prepare them for combat. This is to ensure that they can meet the highest standards. North Korean soldiers also go through difficult training. Unfortunately for the Korean People's Army, there are many social and economic obstacles for soldiers to overcome during basic training. Several reports have provided evidence that although the training is rigorous for North Korean soldiers, oftentimes malnourishment and corruption hinders the abilities of the soldiers to complete their training. It would seem that the trainers and teachers are oftentimes more focused on their own needs than those of their recruits. This would negatively affect a North Korean soldier's capability during a battle. Time served in each country is also vastly different. In the United States military, a soldier is required to provide service for 4 years. They can always extend their tours or rejoin after their assigned time is up, but 4 years is required once enlisted. In the North Korean military, men must serve 10 years, women serve 7 years, and if you're lucky enough to be part of Kim Jong-un's personal bodyguard, you must serve for 13 years. If you're an American soldier, the government will oftentimes support or pay for your college education after you serve. In North Korea, citizens can go to college, but the military does not provide direct assistance. Normally, a North Korean will defer military enlistment until after college, but they still must serve their country in the military regardless. This does not seem like the best incentive for the happiness or well-being of soldiers in the North Korean military. But if you're fortunate enough to go to college and get a degree, you only need to serve for 5 years. Unless you get a degree in science or engineering, then service only lasts 3 years. Apparently, it pays to be a scientist in North Korea. After basic training for a US soldier, they move into advanced individual training. This is where the soldier's skills and expertise are developed so that they can be the best soldier possible. The US Army describes this training as the time you'll learn the skills to perform your Army job. Whatever job that might be, a US Army soldier can be sure they'll receive training and guidance in their field. The same cannot be said about North Korean soldiers. They receive basic training and they are immediately assigned a detail. No further training required or offered. They're on their own. The requirements and training for each soldier up to this point seem to be vastly different. At the end of the training regimen, the American soldier has been given incentives and special training, while the North Korean soldier has been forced to enlist for many years with no special training. The American soldier seems to have the advantage thus far. The United States Army prides itself on providing a comfortable lifestyle for their soldiers. The Army makes it clear that a soldier's duties are to uphold the Constitution and protect American freedoms. And just like all United States citizen, soldiers are given free time to spend with their families and friends, as well as take part in other interests. The Army provides soldiers with access to education, housing, health insurance, and other basic necessities. The same cannot be said about how the North Korean government treats their soldiers. Accounts of superiors turning a blind eye when their soldiers are being abused or in need of help is common. Also, bribes are a norm when in the military. Soldiers who have escaped North Korea have said that military personnel would take bribes and threaten citizens with jail time if they did not pay. But this different mentality is rooted in the lack of basic living necessities that North Korean soldiers have. Unlike the American soldiers, there's no continuing education for the soldiers of North Korea, no top-of-the-line hospitals or health facilities, and housing conditions are not maintained to adequate basic living standards. Worst of all, most accounts coming out of North Korea state that the soldiers, just like the citizens, are malnourished and underfed. It's been reported that soldiers in the special units are taken care of. However, as one defector recounted, the average soldier is only given 2 or 3 potatoes a meal, or are fed solely on raw corn kernels or corn rice. It would seem that the lifestyle of the two soldiers are different in almost every way. To be a formidable combatant, you must be in good health. How does the US soldier stack up against a North Korean soldier when it comes to physical fitness and health standards? Well, it would seem that the American soldier has an advantage here as well. The Army has several programs to support the health of their soldiers. There are specialists that aid American soldiers with safety while exercising, physical fitness trainers that ensure the soldier is working out properly, food specialists that help maintain a healthy diet, and facilities to encourage and support soldiers exercising. The US military takes the lifestyle and health of their soldiers very seriously when they're in the Army. Conversely, the North Korean government does not always take the fitness or nutrition aspect of their soldiers' lives as seriously as one would expect. The biggest difference between the two soldiers is nutrition. North Korean soldiers that have defected and later explained what it was like being a soldier in North Korea often bring up a lack of food. Regular soldiers are almost always malnourished and look for any way to get more food. There are reports of North Korean soldiers having parasites due to lack of sanitation as well. One account states that whenever a soldier becomes too malnourished to carry out their duties, they're sent home to recover with their family. However, the lack of nutrition and poor lifestyle of most families leads to that soldier remaining malnourished or worse. Nutrition and fitness play a role in the body stature of a soldier. North Korean soldiers are several inches shorter than the average American soldier. Lack of nutrition and fitness also has reduced the body and muscle mass of North Korean soldiers. Being a soldier in any country is hard work. However, it would seem being a soldier in North Korea is a whole other level of hard, due to the lack of willingness by the government to take care of health and lifestyles of their soldiers. Two soldiers can be equally well trained, but the equipment they have might give them an advantage in a fight. Let's now compare the equipment of an American soldier to that of a North Korean soldier. We'll start at the head and work our way down. The United States is consistently upgrading and improving their equipment for their soldiers. The standard issue helmet for a US soldier is no different. The American soldier is outfitted with an integrated head protection system. This helmet is made of materials that are lightweight but still protect the soldier's head from bullets and flying debris. According to the head engineer, the helmet is created to be 100% more effective at protecting the American soldier than previous versions. That is impressive. The North Korean helmet is slightly less sophisticated. The standard issue helmet is made entirely of steel. The helmets come either from what was formerly the Soviet Union or a North Korean-made version that is very similar. This would suggest that the helmets of the North Korean soldier have not been updated in several decades, leading to a less capable head protection unit. The United States soldier also receives protection for their body. Each US soldier is given a modular scalable vest as body armor. The newest model is 5 pounds lighter than the previous standard issue body armor. American soldiers can also request to be outfitted with the ballistic pelvet protector for additional protection on the lower body. On top of the body armor, the American soldier also receives a combat shirt that is designed to protect the soldier from fire. A regular North Korean soldier is given no body armor at all. It is reported that high-ranking officers and special forces may receive some body protection, but the average soldier's body is only protected by their canvas uniform. Not ideal when in a battle. What about boots? Maybe North Korean soldiers have boots that are specially made to grip the ground and protect their feet and ankles? It would seem that this is not the case either. Although many US soldiers prefer to buy their own non-government issued boots, the US Army has been putting a lot of time and resources into designing the best footwear possible for these soldiers. North Korean soldiers, on the other hand, often get used or low-quality boots to wear. The design has not changed for several decades. It would seem that the American soldier has the North Korean beaten in terms of lifestyle, health, and combat attire. But what about weapons? North Korea is run by a dictator as a military state. They pump billions of dollars into their military programs, so maybe it's all going to standard issue weapons on the North Korean soldier. There are several standard issue pistols for an American soldier to choose from. It often depends on the soldier's role and preferences as to which gun they end up with. Most of the pistols at the American soldier's disposal are 9mm. Soldiers receive the M17 or M18, which are designed to reduce jamming and provide a more durable weapon. North Korean soldiers are most often given older models of pistols, such as the Browning M1900, the Russian Makarov pistol, or PM, and Russian TT-30A. Again, these guns were state-of-the-art decades ago, but as long as the pistols are maintained, they should still fire when the trigger is pulled. When it comes to firepower, the soldier's best friend tends to be their assault rifle. ARs are versatile and powerful, so many soldiers are issued them as their primary weapon. The American soldier can be equipped with several different rifles. The most common are the M4 and M16A2. Both guns are designed to be resilient and powerful. The main difference between the two weapons is the M16A2 has a slightly longer barrel for an extended range. The North Korean soldier is normally issued a Chinese assault rifle. Most often, they're given the Type 56 or Type 63. Both weapons resemble the AK-47. They're slightly bulkier than the US rifles, but are reliable and accurate. However, like the pistols, it's important to note that the North Korean soldier tends to be issued much older weapons. It would be very unfortunate in a battle if the soldier before you did not take good care of the weapon, as it could lead to misfiring or jamming at an inconvenient time. Really, what it comes down to is the US soldier has one of the richest and most powerful nations in the world backing them, while the North Korean soldier is doing the best with what they have. The American soldier has the advantage in terms of health, fitness, and lifestyle. They have more protection to their head and body, while also being issued more modern combat technology. The North Korean soldier would be going into a fight malnourished, with no body armor, and old or heavily used weapons. Despite summits between North Korea's Kim Jong-un and the United States' President Trump, tensions on the Korean peninsula remain markedly high. During his meetings with President Trump, Kim Jong-un promised to stop, or at least heavily curtail, his nation's nuclear program. And yet, American intelligence agencies have extensive intelligence showing that not only is activity at North Korea's secret nuclear labs not halting, they are in fact still fully operational. The reason why is simple. North Korea needs nuclear weapons if it's to survive as an independent power, and Kim Jong-un needs nuclear weapons if he's to personally remain in power. Not just a nation's future, but its leader's future is wrapped up in the successful development of nuclear weapons, and thus no intelligence official in the world believes that North Korea will ever halt its nuclear ambitions unless forced to by military action. Yet despite an increasingly sophisticated nuclear weapons program, the US has been hesitant to use military force against the Hermit Kingdom for fear of sparking a full-blown war on the Korean peninsula. The stakes for inaction, however, are about as high as taking action, with a nuclear North Korea completely destabilizing the security environment of Asia's eastern shores. Japan, long a target of North Korea's ire, has already taken the incredible steps of discarding large parts of its traditionalist pacifist military doctrine and authorized the use of expeditionary forces to support American operations in Asia. This means that for the first time since World War II, Japan is officially sanctioning the use of military force preemptively against foreign powers. Were North Korea to become nuclear armed, it's likely that Japan, Asia's rising military power, would very quickly become even more aggressive, if not preemptively launch a war against North Korea that would force the US to follow suit. While Japan is protected under the US's nuclear umbrella, it would have no reason to develop nuclear weapons of its own. But the Japanese view a nuclear-armed North Korea as completely unacceptable and will stop at nothing to prevent this from happening. For decades, the United States prepared for war with North Korea alongside its South Korean allies, and for nearly that entire time, operational planning changed little in how that war would be executed. A new war between the Koreas would play out much in the same way as the last war, with large formations of ground units maneuvering against hordes of North Korean troops. The war would, in essence, be fully conventional in every sense of the word, and aside from vastly improved technology on the US and South Korean side, there would be little difference in execution from the way the last war was fought in the late 1940s, early 1950s. In the last few years, though, the United States and South Korea have rethought their strategy for defeating the North in a war. A new operational plan, known as O-Plan 5015, has replaced the old wartime plan, O-Plan 5027, and differs sharply in scope and strategy. While many details of the new plan to crush North Korea remain secret, there are many parts of it which have become public knowledge, and other parts that can be guessed at given the state of the US military doctrine and the types of troops and equipment being deployed in the Korean peninsula. O-Plan 5015 has been largely shaped by greatly improved intelligence gathering inside the Hermit United Kingdom itself, as well as new technological developments by the US and new political developments within the country itself. High-ranking North Korean defectors have given the US and South Korea a better insight into the inner power and political circles of North Korean politics, and revealed a nation that is completely under centralized control and under the Kim family's thumb, in a way that makes its military command and control uniquely vulnerable to disruption. If Kim Jong-un were to be quickly removed from power, unclear lines of secession and a total lack of independent authority from local commanders means that the North Korean military would be completely paralyzed and unable to operate effectively. Much like Soviet military units during the Cold War, military commanders on the ground must always gain the approval of their superiors before taking any action. The results of this type of extreme and suffocating top-down command structure were on full display during the First Gulf War in the 1990s, when American and Allied troops completely dismantled Iraq's formidable armies by taking apart its communication systems. Without the ability to contact their superiors, local battlefield commanders were all but paralyzed in their decision-making process, while NATO forces enjoyed a large degree of autonomy and independence that allowed them to be a reactive and flexible force. A big part of O-Plan 5015 thus revolves around the destruction of North Korea's communication systems, which in this case means targeting broadcast facilities and telephone networks either with special forces, kinetic strikes, or electronic warfare. The disruption in communications would leave North Korea's highly rigid and inflexible commanders paralyzed, allowing US and South Korean forces to outmaneuver and destroy them. Yet, while this was always part of the US's plans on fighting North Korea, where O-Plan 5015 differs is that for the first time it hints at waging a very selective war rather than the total war scenario outlined in previous war plans. Previously, US and South Korean forces were expected to initially fight a retreating action against North Korea's overwhelming superiority in numbers. While its military equipment is largely dated, North Korea retains a huge amount of combat troops and the vehicles to quickly move them from the north into the south. And on the ground, North Korea features a massive concentration of tens of thousands of artillery batteries, which can completely overwhelm the American and South Korean forces along the border. Yet, intelligence has shown that North Korea lacks the resources to continue an offensive deep into South Korea and would completely stall out in a matter of weeks. Thus, old war plans called for a defense-in-depth action against North Korea's initial attacks, with US ROK forces falling back along predetermined defensive positions and bleeding DPRK forces as they did so. Once the US air power had transitioned into the Pacific theater in force within a day or two, DPRK forces would be subjected to a bombing campaign for the history books and absolutely savaged from the air. Then US ROK forces would begin to push back into North Korea to ultimately take Pyongyang. The new war plan calls for the US and South Korea to resist the initial attack as before, only now instead of launching a full military campaign into North Korea, the plan instead calls for a surgical war against select military targets. In the opening stages of the war, an electronic warfare campaign against the North's forces would target their radar and communication systems, blinding and confusing commanders on the ground. Simultaneously, US B-2 stealth bombers would deliver ground penetration munitions against North Korea's nuclear sites, while a special strike force would immediately launch an attack against North Korean government facilities. American and South Korean special forces would penetrate deep into North Korea, likely using the same stealth Black Hawk helicopter design briefly seen during the raid against bin Laden's compound in Pakistan, though they might also be inserted via extremely high altitude or halo jumps. The goal of these specialized kill teams would be simple: the elimination of Kim Jong-un and his senior military leadership, and this is an operation that the US and South Korea have trained for extensively. By eliminating Kim Jong-un and any immediate successors, the North Korean government would be thrown into disarray. Completely centralized control may have allowed the Kim family to rule North Korea with an iron grip, but it has also created a terrible vulnerability, which the US and its South Korean allies would very quickly exploit in the case of a war. As the testimony of high-ranking North Korean defectors has shown, the internal political situation within North Korea is extremely unstable and relies on the continued rule of Kim Jong-un. This is a fact further attested to by the spree of murders undertaken by Kim Jong-un upon his rise to power, as he consolidated his right to rule by the elimination of discovered and imagined political rivals who were suspected of wanting to seize power for himself. Some of those killed were even members of the Kim family itself. Without central control and with a systemic and overwhelming bombing campaign carried out by the US and South Korea, already low morale in North Korean troops would begin deserting en masse. It's believed that despite the heavy indoctrination undergone by North Korean soldiers, the average soldier would be extremely vulnerable to psychological warfare operations undertaken after the elimination of North Korea's command structure, and further helped by the intense bombardment and overwhelming firepower deployed by American and South Korean air and naval forces. O-Plan 5015 differs wildly from its predecessors by instead calling for a limited war that exploits the use of sophisticated new smart weapon systems, intelligence gathered from years of reconnaissance of the North, and the inherent political instabilities built into the North Korean command and control system. While still fully prepared to fight a conventional total war scenario, the US and South Korea hope to limit the scale and cost of the war for both sides by instead relying on a series of very rapid and precise surgical strikes. This has the added benefit of curtailing a possible Chinese response, as a full-scale military invasion of the North may once more prompt China to dispatch large numbers of troops into the peninsula. While China lacks the military capabilities to win a war against the US, it could make a ground war in the Korean peninsula a very costly affair for America. During the Cold War, the Soviet Union was North Korea's lifeline, providing weapons, supplies, training, and even some limited military assistance to the North Korean government. While US and Soviet troops never clashed on the ground on the Korean peninsula, Soviet fighters provided some limited cover over certain parts of North Korea, though refused North Korea's requests to fly frontline combat support against American jets. Without the Soviet Union, North Korea would have fallen to the south, and today the Hermit Kingdom and the Kim family would not exist. A very obvious win for all of humanity. Today, Russia engages in only minor trade with the internationally shunned kingdom and no longer directly finances or supports it. With North Korea owing its existence to the old Soviet Union, though, could North Korea repay that favor by teaming up with modern Russia against its greatest international rival, the United States? Could North Korea and Russia team up to destroy the US? We've looked at a potential conflict between the US and Russia before and already determined that the Russian military is simply not capable of winning a war against the American military. The modern Russian military is made up of just over 1 million active duty personnel, with US forces numbering around 1.4 million. There isn't just a numbers disparity though, as there is also a training and morale disparity between the two militaries. Despite attempts to move to an all-volunteer force by the Russian military, it's still overwhelmingly made up of conscripts, versus an all-volunteer military fielded by the US. Conscripts historically greatly underperform versus volunteer military forces, and suffer both from morale and training issues, two things which would be of a grave concern to a Russia fighting an uphill war against a more technologically capable opponent. However, what if North Korea lent its forces to the fight, bolstering Russian numbers so that they dwarfed America's? With an active duty military of 1.3 million, Russian and North Korean forces combined would number at 2.3 million, outnumbering the US by 700,000, a significant advantage. Of course, in a real conflict, neither side could use its full military in a conflict against the other, as both sides in this hypothetical war would need to maintain its military presences in other strategically important areas. Russia would still need to secure its eastern border against NATO's counterattack upon declaring a war on the US, as NATO's charter states that an attack on one is an attack on all, automatically triggering a declaration of war by the entire alliance on the aggressor. Without the US's homeland and overseas forces stationed outside of Europe, though, NATO would be unable to prosecute a war against Russia, as Europe's militaries are simply too weak to stand up to Russia in anything but a defensive war. To make matters worse, some countries such as Canada and Germany are experiencing serious logistical issues, which leaves large parts of their forces combat ineffective. In 2019, the German Air Force was incapable of sustaining the type of air operations needed in a conflict against Russia due to a lack of equipment and maintenance issues with its planes, with Canada suffering a similar issue and a fighter shortage that left it unable to fulfill its commitments to North American aerospace defense. Still, with Russian forces elsewhere, NATO could pose serious problems for Russia, and thus Russia would need to retain a significant bulwark to deter against NATO aggression on its eastern front. North Korea also has strategic concerns that leave it unable to fully commit its forces to a fight against the US, as despite being the 25th most powerful military in the world, it faces South Korea directly across the DMZ, which it's currently ranked as the world's 6th most powerful military. The United States, perhaps though, has a worse strategic picture than either of these two nations, as its military forces are deployed around the world in a variety of strategic hotspots, and very often it's these military forces that ensure regional peace and stability. Its large commitment in the Middle East ensures that conflict does not arise between historical rivals, such as Iran and Saudi Arabia, which would have devastating consequences for the global economy. Iran's strategic goals in a potential conflict against Saudi Arabia or the US is to shut down the Persian Gulf oil trade, which, thanks to the geography of the Gulf of Oman, it could easily do by threatening oil tankers with long-range standoff weapons that the US or any of its allies could do little about. Iranian special forces could even scuttle a tanker in the Suez Canal, yet another military objective of Iran in case of a war, which would choke off one of the world's most important trade arteries for weeks, possibly months. In the South Pacific, US forces help maintain the balance between China and its neighbors, with China being a particularly bad actor in the region and bullying or outright stealing territory and resources from nations like the Philippines, Vietnam, and others. China and Japan, longtime rivals, also rely on the U.S. presence to maintain stable relationships, with the threat of American firepower backing up its Japanese allies, keeping China's behavior in check. Realistically, both sides could only count on perhaps half of their total military power in a conflict against the other. Though, in this regard, the US has an advantage as it has long operated its military under a doctrine that states it must be able to fight and defeat two near-peer adversaries simultaneously anywhere in the world. For this reason, the US maintains the world's largest sea and airborne mobility fleet, allowing it to quickly move forces around the world to any conflict, but also giving it the advantage of quickly replacing frontline forces in need of rest and recuperation with reserve forces stationed elsewhere on peacekeeping duties. This ability will ensure the integrity of the US frontline forces better than North Korea and Russia, who both have major shortfalls in mobility and will be forced to leave their frontline forces in theater for longer, wearing on morale, equipment, and unit integrity from casualties. Mobility is a major challenge for the Russian-North Korean alliance. North Korean mobility is all but nil, with only a token air or sea mobility force used to counter South Korean advances into its territory. Russia operates a far larger mobility command, though it is on its own barely enough to move Russian forces in significant quantities anywhere around the world, and far short of what would be needed for a major offensive against a military power such as the US. With only 12 of its heaviest transport aircraft, the Antonov AN-124, in service, the only aircraft capable of moving heavy military equipment in significant quantities, Russia would be hard-pressed to quickly move critical tanks, air defense assets, and artillery to the North American continent for an invasion. Its fleet of 109 Ilyushin Tu-76 aircraft could supplement that airlift capacity, but on their own, these aircraft would only be able to move perhaps a platoon's worth of soldiers and their equipment, and one main battle tank per flight. At sea, the Russian Navy doesn't fare much better, with a fleet of only about 20 landing ships with another 2 in reserve. Each of these ships could carry around 20 tanks and up to 425 troops, and even if Russia could muster its entire mobility fleet at once, which is not realistic as due to the maintenance and retrofit requirements, no navy on Earth ever has full use of all of its ships at one time, Russia could still move 440 tanks and perhaps 2 regiments of infantry per sortie. Even with no casualties amongst the landing ships and no equipment breakdowns through perhaps some miracle, it would take over 6 months to move the entire North Korean and Russian military to North America. Deciding on where to land in the US, though, would be vital for the Russian-North Korean alliance, and there are few good options. Even if we ignored the reality of NATO or South Korea, Australia, and Japan coming to the US's defense, and Russia could concentrate its forces for an assault on North America, it would still need to get through the teeth of the American Navy. An invasion of America would require months of preparation, moving naval and air assets to Russia's west coast, which would afford the US just as much time to prepare to counter such an invasion. With the US concentrating its naval forces in the Pacific, the most direct route would be the best route, with Russian-North Korean forces striking directly into Alaska to secure a foothold on North America. Anchorage would be the most ideal target for an invasion, as it holds a large deepwater port that would make it possible to quickly offload forces. An assault against any other part of the Alaskan coast would require the use of landing craft, something which is also in short supply in the Russian Navy. Invading Alaska poses several problems, as the Japanese found out in World War II. First, it's too far away from the American heartland to pose any serious economic or industrial risk to the US's warfighting effort. While oil-rich, the US would easily be able to supplement its consumption via the Gulf of Mexico or even overseas sources, and the seizure of Alaskan oil fields would result in extremely minor economic harm to the US economy. Still, with such limited mobility assets, Alaska would be the best bet for the alliance to gain a vitally important foothold in North America. Russian invasion craft, however, would face the full wrath of the world's largest submarine fleet, in an environment that's keenly suited for submarine warfare thanks to the turbulent nature of the Bering Sea. Even in summertime, the Bering can be treacherous to cross, and winter operations for heavy military cargo craft would be all but impossible. Anti-submarine operations in the rough seas are an extremely dicey proposition, and while Russia does maintain a capable attack submarine fleet, it's dwarfed in size and capabilities by the American fleet. To make matters worse, Russia only operates a single aircraft carrier, and the nation severely lacks an aerial refueling craft. As if that wasn't bad enough, only a portion of the Russian Air Force is even capable of in-flight refueling, meaning that for the crossing across the Bering Sea, the invasion fleet would be largely without air cover. The US, on the other hand, has two major Air Force installations in Alaska, Eielson and Elmendorf Air Force bases, and in the months leading up to the invasion would quickly expand their capacity to host the rest of the significantly large American Air Force by building extra runways, hangars, and maintenance facilities. Even without its use of its 11 aircraft carriers, of which realistically only perhaps 5 would be available for combat ops at any one time, the US Air Force would easily defend Alaska from invasion. And with a fleet of about 450 aerial tankers, the largest in the world, American jets would have the range to cover any possible invasion avenue. With 31 AWACS aircraft, or Airborne Warning and Control System, in its fleet, the US Air Force would be able to supplement its land-based radar coverage to detect Russian ships and air forces at great ranges. Russia, on the other hand, only operates about 15 to 19 AWACS systems, and despite their long range, the lack of air refueling capabilities in the Russian Air Forces would mean very limited sortie rates and loitering times both. In effect, a serious deficiency in airborne radar, aerial refueling, and military transport would make an invasion of Alaska completely impossible. The logistics simply don't exist for the alliance to make such an attempt, and with major army bases in Alaska and fast rail and airborne transport capabilities by the US, even if Russian landing craft managed to make it through the teeth of the US Navy and Air Force both, they would be completely overwhelmed by American land forces and destroyed in a very short matter of time. An attempt could be made to cross the North Pole's ice cap, though such an attempt would have to be done in winter, meaning horrible weather conditions which would wreak havoc on men and equipment both. Then there's also the problem of extended supply lines, and even with ad hoc airfields quickly built on the ice, an invasion force would still lack the air cover needed to be protected from the American Air Force. Even if by some miracle the alliance managed to take Alaska, which, let's be clear, this is a complete strategic impossibility, the United States and its warfighting capability would be negligibly affected by the invasion. The alliance would have to push into the continental US to seriously damage its industrial and military capabilities to wage war, and that would mean pushing through Canada and adding yet another combatant to the fight, as Canada would under no circumstances allow such an invasion force to simply stroll through its territory. To make matters worse, the force would have to move through very difficult terrain which would heavily favor American and Canadian defenders, and as it moved further and further south, it would face even greater numbers of American air forces. In Alaska, American air forces would be limited by the physical space available on the airfields to host them. But in the continental US, the widespread number of large civilian airports and military air bases means that the vast American Air Force would still be able to be brought down on the invasion force in full effect, while Russian forces would still only be able to operate a token number of aircraft from seized Alaskan and Canadian airfields, and only operate at limited ranges due to a lack of aerial refueling assets. North Korea would be able to give Russia the numbers needed to seriously challenge the United States, but in terms of technology and additional assets, it would offer very little to the alliance. If anything, the added burden of supplying and transporting North Korean troops might even seriously damage Russia's own capabilities. After all, there's little possibility that North Korea could actually maintain the supply requirements of its vast military past a few weeks. In the end, as we've seen before countless times in these scenarios, America's homeland could never be breached by an invading force due to the current lack of mobility and logistical support aircraft and ships amongst the world's navies. If any nation on Earth were to attempt it, they would need to heavily invest in building at least as large a mobility and logistical fleet as the US, because it doesn't matter how many guns you have, if you can't move them in significant numbers quickly enough, any invasion is bound to fail. Whenever you hear about North Korea, the news is usually ominous, with the Western media mostly talking about weapons or the country's sometimes laughable cult of personality thing. You don't usually see images of people just doing normal things, some little boy named Kwang Ho playing with his toys, or his father Jae-hyun working his 9-to-5 job. That's not always the media's fault, since North Korea is a pretty closed-off country. Whenever media has been allowed to enter the nation, what they see often seems staged. But life goes on there, and things are pretty ordinary from day to day. Let's now see how their lives might compare to yours. We say we'll try and focus on the ordinary day-to-day existence of a North Korean, but one thing we should first ask is, can those guys just leave? We mean, for you, if you felt like going on a vacation to the Swiss Alps or sitting on a beach in Thailand, you could just do that if you had the cash. It's a pretty big deal, this being allowed to leave thing. So can North Koreans take vacations abroad? The answer is a resounding no. North Koreans can forget about skiing in Europe or partying on exotic beaches. But more than that, most people in the country won't even have access to other parts of their own nation. We're not talking about the political elite here, just the average North Korean. In fact, there aren't that many cars in the country, so just going on a road trip is not possible for most people. The country does have a car manufacturer, Pyeonghwa Motors, but there are some foreign-made cars on the streets. But your average citizen won't have access to a car or fuel. Satellite pictures tell the story, because outside of the cities, there are hardly any cars at all. You have to be special to get a car, and only 11 out of every 1,000 people can get their hands on one. We expect these folks are what you might call the elite. On the upside, you'll find public transport options in the cities. People have to get to work. The city has to function. In the capital, you'll find rail, buses, trams, taxis, and a subway. It's really not a thing at all for a normal person just to get in a car and go somewhere. And the fact that about 97% of the roads throughout the country are unpaved makes it hard to drive anywhere anyway. We can't find updated figures, but from satellite images taken some years ago, there were only 449 miles of paved roads. What you see in the videos in the capital are the best roads around, and what you don't see is what the North Korean government doesn't want you to see. Okay, so that's a bummer for North Koreans, but what if one evening Mr. Chan-woo wants to go around to his friend's house, Mr. Kang-min, and play a game of cards over an ice cold beer? First of all, North Korea does have its own brand of beer, and it's by far the most popular alcoholic drink. That brand of beer is called Taedonggang beer. North Koreans are not forced to be teetotalers by any stretch of the imagination. Let's say that these two guys have office jobs in the capital of Pyongyang. That city has a population of around 3.3 million, and there are about 25.7 million folks living in the entire country. It would be difficult for us to compare every lifestyle in North Korea for you, because city dwellers will live very differently from those in the countryside. Let's stick with these two guys in the city for now. Unlike you, even though these two men might have good jobs, they can't actually buy their apartments. They live where the government sends them, and they work in the occupation that has been allocated to them. But if the men want to visit each other, of course they can do that. They might sink some cold ones with South Korean soap operas playing on the TV, and they might even get together for a bit of karaoke, which is very popular in the country. We even found that some people will get movies on the black market, and that black market exists despite the risks. On the weekend, a family might visit an amusement park such as the Kaesong Youth Park or the Manyongdae Fun Fair. They might exercise, enjoy swimming, or even go horseback riding. If they have a high status, they might try ice skating rinks, golf, or even head to a ski resort. Yes, there is one, and it's called the Masingnyeong Ski Resort. How is this all paid for? Well, some people don't seem to get a wage at all, but they are provided housing and food. The public distribution system provides food to most of the country, but wages can be paid too, and what you get depends on what you do. We found a few resources that said your average city factory worker will get about $62 a month, which might not pay for the luxury stuff, but some folks might get $1,000 or $2,000 a month. Those people could eat less of the free food and head to one of the private restaurants and markets. From what we can see, some kinds of businesses are illegal, but the government might turn a blind eye to that. To recap, if Mr. Chan-woo and Mr. Kang-min are living in an urban area and have good jobs such as IT or banking, they certainly can travel around the city, spend time at each other's houses, buy food and black market items, read secondhand Harry Potter books, and take their families ice skating. What they can't do is access the internet. Well, the one you can access, or travel around their own country. As for the richer folks, sometimes called the donju, one journalist said they might spend tens of dollars on food at restaurants, drink foreign alcohol, and wear brand names from Western nations. They might throw big house parties and even have their own karaoke machines. Singing and dancing is big in North Korea, as is imbibing booze. If the folks are poor, then they might brew their own, something called nongtaiki, but that's technically illegal. As for the poorer people in the countryside, they might have access to free housing and free food too. There have been food shortages and these people have been the hardest hit. So living in agrarian poverty in North Korea is very difficult from the city lifestyle we've just talked about. There's evidence of child labor in the countryside and stunted growth due to malnutrition. There might not be access to electricity, and life can just be grim. On the outskirts of the city, there might be factories, and we saw photos of where those workers might live. In one photo, there were rows of beds in one cramped room, but it was much better than a wood hut without electricity. We should also mention that North Korea has lots of labor camps for people who don't toe the line, but that's another story altogether. Let's get back to ordinary city life. First of all, a big factor in North Korea that is very different from your life is the access to information. The TV, the internet, the newspapers tell a story that doesn't really mirror the stories from the rest of the world. You might find on a North Korean website that Western democracy is demonic, or that North Korean culture goes back 500,000 years. We kid you not. This is a snippet from one North Korean food website. Our ancestors, who lived on Earth from the dawn of human development and pioneered human civilization, created valuable Korean national heritage that can be proud of the world in food culture. Our nation, which has a long history and a splendid culture of 500,000 years. You might talk about post-truth, but at least you have access to information, and you know very well that there was no civilization 500,000 years ago. Far from it. North Korean authorities might provide information more in line with the term pre-truth. Talk about fake news. But does that mean North Koreans don't sit and ponder the meaning of life and the bigger questions like wondering how they got here in the first place? Well, the country has a history of religious practices, including Christianity, Buddhism, and Korean shamanism. But the state is officially atheist. People can practice religion in secret, and they have, but they might end up in a prison camp. If you get caught with a Christian Bible, you could end up in a lot of trouble or even be executed. We are not going to say North Koreans all buy into the propaganda and aren't skeptical about what their government tells them, but they certainly have to be tight-lipped regarding their beliefs. Whatever the people believe, they're told to support an ideology called Juche. This includes supporting a defined, superhuman, eternal, magnificent national leader. It's related to their cult of personality, which basically means asking the people to believe that their state and their leader are amazing and beyond reproach. Let's now get back to the lighter side of North Korea. How do the people date there? They must fall in love, right? Because love is a universal language no amount of oppression can kick out of us. How do people meet, date, go on dates? Is there a North Korean version of Tinder? Hi, my name is Hyung-won. I'm into eternal devotion of our supreme majestic leader and working hard for our beautiful and prosperous nation. I like karaoke and beer too. That would surely limit a person to swiping left. If you love the leader, then would she have to like you? We found romance information from a North Korean exile, so the information is straight from the horse's mouth, so to speak. He said he lived in Pyongyang and wasn't allowed to travel outside of the city. He said that the government tried hard to sell love as a kind of collective thing, a love for the revolution and comrades, but people just fell in love like anyone else does. Dating wasn't a political thing. He said the very conservative norms of dating were beginning to become a thing of the past with his generation. And a big reason for that was that Western culture was finding its way into North Korea. People were beginning to see a bigger world. The man said that some of his young friends weren't even buying into the government propaganda, and they were well aware of the oppression that hung over them. Finding love was an antidote to this feeling of disempowerment. He met a girl in high school and fell madly in love, but that ended quickly when she joined the military. Just about all men will have to do time in the military, and a lot of women will too. But if you come from an elite family or show great acumen for your studies or are ill, you can postpone or get away with it. Anyway, the girl was gone. But he found another girl, and this time she asked him out. This is what he wrote in the Guardian newspaper. In my high school days when I was highly sentimental, my fellow students and I would go on dates in the park only when it was completely pitch black outside. High school students weren't allowed to freely date in the open. After high school, things got better because then he was allowed to date out in the open. Guys and girls would often dance at a social club, and there they would stand around first, and then usually a guy would pick up the courage to ask a girl for a dance. He said one of the problems, of course, is most men after school are away doing their military service. While they're doing that service, the parents might be looking around for a suitable woman for the man to marry when he returns. He said this doesn't always end up good, but people shouldn't think North Korean life is all that different from your life. We'd like to end the show with something the guy concluded, only because it's a perfect and fitting ending. This is what he said. When you step back and observe the reality of North Korean society, you'll see that people go on about their daily lives just like the rest of the world. The window through which you can look into North Korea is very small and limited, but remember that the lifestyle of North Koreans isn't very different from yours. The only things they don't know about are freedom and human rights. So there you go, the facts from a North Korean. You might live in a different environment, but your body aches, your mind creates, and your heart yearns for love and friendship just like theirs does. As far as killing its own citizens goes, the United States and the Democratic People's Republic of Korea see eye to eye. Both these countries still have the death penalty. Their two systems are vastly different, and it's no secret that North Korea and the United States don't get along. Yet it's interesting to note that the death penalty is something both these countries have in common, even though most of the world has stopped using it for human rights reasons. As we examine death row in North Korea and the United States, there are many differences. There's also some similarities that might surprise you. Whether you agree with the death penalty or not, the fact remains both the United States of America and North Korea are 2 of 54 countries in the entire world that still use the death penalty. Just so we're clear, there are 141 countries that have outlawed the practice. So the US and North Korea are not in the majority. In 2020, Amnesty International recorded 483 executions in 18 countries. This means that although 54 countries may have the death penalty, they are not actually using it all the time. 2020 was a crazy year, but statistically there was a 26% decrease in executions from the previous year. China is still the world's leader in executions, but where do the United States and North Korea fall on this list? Due to the lack of data and information coming out of the DPRK, it's hard to say just how many executions happen per year. To be fair, the number will always be much higher than we think, because the government isn't held accountable to anyone but itself, so they can pretty much do whatever they want to its citizens. This includes making people disappear or killing them without cause. In a way, everyone in North Korea is on death row at all times. The United States, on the other hand, has a judicial system that allows for a fair trial. It's not a perfect system, and mistakes have been made in the past where people who were innocent have been executed, but at least there is some accountability. The US is also one of only 2 countries in the Americas that still has the death penalty, the other being Trinidad and Tobago. Although Trinidad and Tobago has not carried out an execution since 1979. The United States executed 17 people in the year 2020. This puts the US 6th on the list of the most executions in the last few years. The 5 countries ahead of the US are China, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Iraq, and Egypt. However, it's a pretty safe bet that if we had any data from North Korea, it would be pretty high on the list. It's currently unknown how many people there are on death row in North Korea or even how many people have been executed. These statistics are closely guarded by the North Korean government, and they refuse to release crime statistics of any kind. What we do know of death row in North Korea comes mostly from defectors, and unfortunately not many of them make it out of the country alive. The United States does release data around the number of people from death row executed each year. In 2020, the number of executions dropped from the previous year by over 20%. On October 1, 2020, there were 2,553 inmates on death row in the U.S. There seems to be a trend of less people being executed in the U.S. each year, but only time will tell if this will continue. Unlike in North Korea, the death penalty varies by state in the U.S. As of right now, there are 27 states that still use the death penalty. This means that in the remaining 23 U.S. states, the death penalty is illegal. In North Korea, 100% of the country is subject to the death penalty. You may be wondering what can send someone to death row in North Korea versus the US. The crimes that can get someone sentenced to death in the 2 countries are actually quite similar. In both North Korea and the United States, someone can be given the death penalty for treason and espionage. However, only in North Korea can you be sentenced to death for political dissidence, consumption of media that has not been approved by the government, and practicing a form of religion other than the state ideology of Juche. However, like in North Korea, someone can get the death penalty in the US for murder, rape, and large-scale drug trafficking as well. Once someone has committed a crime punishable by death, both countries have different ways of going through the trial process. In North Korea, the government says everyone gets a trial where they can defend themselves in court. But by all accounts, it's just a charade. The trial is never fair, the verdict is most likely known going into the court. And that is even if someone's lucky enough to get to court. Oftentimes, the judiciary process is bypassed altogether, and the accused is just sent immediately to death row. In the United States, offenders are allowed to remain silent during the initial arrest and have a lawyer present during all future questioning. People in North Korea receive neither of these things. The defendant in the United States then gets a fair trial with an impartial jury, and the case is based on evidence. In an ideal situation, the defendant is innocent until proven guilty in the United States. However, in North Korea, if the government thinks you're guilty, you are guilty, no matter what. After being convicted and sent to death row in the United States, a defendant can still appeal their case, or a deal might even be made for a reduced sentence. This is to say there are options for death row inmates, especially those whose punishment may not fit the crime. There are no appeals, no deals, and no hope to be had if someone finds himself on death row in North Korea. Due to lack of information coming out of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, we may never actually know how many people are executed there each year. However, from sources such as defectors and human rights organizations that are trying to make sense of the matter, we do have a few statistics. For example, Amnesty International reported there were around 105 executions between 2007 and 2012 in North Korea. From news sources such as Daily North Korea and Radio Free Asia, it's been reported that 2 men and a woman were publicly executed by firing squad in 2021 for distributing South Korean movies in the country. These statistics are just the tip of the iceberg, and many believe that hundreds of people are being sentenced to death each year by the North Korean government. There have been approximately 300 people from death row executed in the United States over the last decade. It's hard to tell whether this is more or less than North Korea, but the conditions in the prison camps where people on death row wait for executions in North Korea are something straight from a nightmare. In the United States, prisoners at least get the basics. They receive food and occasional recreational time depending on the prison and crime. Mental illness tends to run rampant on death row in the US, and the cells can be uncomfortable, but there are legal and civil rights organizations that fight for prisoners' well-being. There's no denying that the mental health of death row inmates in the US could be taken a little more seriously, especially since the UN says more than 15 days in solitary confinement is torture. It's not uncommon for a death row inmate to spend much more than 15 days in solitary in the US. When sentenced to death row in North Korea, people are tortured, starved, and even murdered in the prison camps where they're held. These facilities aren't so much prisons as they are internment camps. It's sometimes referred to as a gulag system, reminiscent of the forced labor camps Joseph Stalin implemented in the Soviet Union. One of the main differences between people on death row in the two countries is that in North Korea, most prisoners don't even know what they're being detained for. There doesn't seem to be a distinction between petty criminals and those on death row in North Korea, as they're all sent to the same prison camps where they lose their basic human rights. In the United States, a prisoner cannot be sent to death row until after they are tried and found guilty. Within the North Korean prison camps themselves, death row inmates and everyone else are engaged in forced labor and torture. Routine executions and death from the conditions in the camps are reported to be common. So regardless of who you are or what you did, if you are in a North Korean prison camp, you are pretty much already on death row. In the United States, the execution of a death row inmate is planned well ahead of time. They know when they'll be put to death and are given a last meal. This doesn't mean waiting for your execution isn't scary, but at least the prisoner knows it's coming, and even what to expect, since the only means of execution currently in the US is lethal injection. In North Korea, a prisoner may not know what they are even being detained for, let alone what their sentence is or when it will be carried out. If you're unlucky enough to be on death row in North Korea, your execution could happen at any time and at any location. The main way death row prisoners are executed in North Korea seems to be by firing squad. That is, unless they die in the prison camp first. It has been reported that there are more gruesome ways that death row prisoners in North Korea have been executed. Depending on the crime, a firing squad might not be the method used. Prisoners could be hung or decapitated in public. These forms of execution seem to be reserved for high-ranking criminals such as officials convicted of drug trafficking or embezzlement, and those suspected of defecting or treason. The death penalty in the United States is a hot-button issue. Some are vehemently against it, while others support it. There are arguments to be made on both sides, and in the United States, people can have that debate. But what about in North Korea? Do the citizens of the country support the death penalty? Like most things in North Korea, it's hard to know. If you ask the government, North Koreans support everything they do, from working people to death in their prison camps to making sure their supreme leader lives a lavish lifestyle. But we all know this is just a show put on by the propaganda department of the country. What the people of North Korea believe or want is of no importance to the government. They are the ultimate authority, and anyone who disagrees with them may find themselves on death row. In 2019, the Transitional Justice Working Group, an NGO in South Korea, released a report that mapped out 318 sites where the North Korean government carried out public executions. In the United States, executions are no longer public and are carried out only in a handful of facilities. In North Korea, executions have taken place near rivers, markets, sports stadiums, and even schools. It's been suspected that during public executions in North Korea, family members and children are forced to watch their loved ones die. What it comes down to is that in North Korea, death row is somewhat of a free-for-all. There's not really a system in place other than if someone is believed to have committed a crime, they're found guilty without a real trial, sent to a prison camp to work and starve, and then publicly executed without any warning. In the United States, there's a process that leads to someone being sent to death row, and even this is becoming less and less prevalent over recent years.
The red button's been pushed, and a nuclear warhead is rocketing towards us. What are our chances of blasting it out of the atmosphere? Is it really all over once that button is pushed, or is there one last chance of destroying the missile before it destroys us? Can a third party destroy a missile mid-flight? Today we take a look at the US ground-based defense system and see what would happen in the advent of a ballistic missile strike from a hostile nation. Is the US set up to defend itself against such an attack? That's what we'll find out. In this episode of the Infographic Show, could you stop a nuclear missile? Firstly, our nuclear defense strategy depends largely on what type of nuclear missile we are dealing with. We have two types, ballistic missiles and cruise missiles, and each present their own set of problems. Let's look at the ballistic nuclear missile first. A ballistic missile follows a chiefly unguided trajectory to deliver one or more nuclear warheads to an arranged target. They are guided for a brief period of flight before gravity and air resistance take over. There are several types of ballistic missiles, including tactical missiles, theater ballistic missiles, intermediate range, and intercontinental ballistic missiles. Nuclear ballistic missiles can be launched from air, land, or sea. The sequence of a Minuteman III launch is as follows. First, the missile is launched from its first stage boost motor. Second, following a minute, the first stage drops off and the stage 2 motor ignites. The missile shroud is ejected. Third, 2 more minutes, and the stage 3 motor replaces the stage 2. Fourth, post-boost vehicle separates from the rocket. Fifth, RVs are deployed. And sixth, nuclear warheads detonate. To knock out one of these bad boys post-launch presents a tough technical challenge, as the time to hit one of these is during the boost phase before the warhead separates after exiting the atmosphere. During this phase, a high-speed anti-missile is possible, but the main problem is the 5-minute time window we have to intercept it, which, when you factor in the speed of acceleration the missile is moving at, is no piece of cake. So for any realistic anti-ballistic missile, you only have about 2 minutes to get it from the launch platform to the target before the nuclear missile is traveling too fast to catch. Surveillance would need to be such that you know the second the enemy has launched a nuclear missile, and you would also need a launch platform for your anti-nuclear missile weapon no more than 100 miles from the target. To intercept a nuclear missile after the separation from the boost rocket or during re-entry presents tough technical challenges. Cruise missiles are a different kettle of fish, and while interception is proportionately more possible than with the ballistic, detecting the launch of a nuclear cruise missile and tracking them is trickier. Being small enough to evade detection by most radar defenses, these missiles can be destroyed by a modern fighter aircraft if detected. A cruise missile is a guided missile used against terrestrial targets. This missile remains in the atmosphere and flies the major portion of its flight at constant speed. They are designed to deliver a large warhead over long distances with a high accuracy rate. Countries who we know have nuclear cruise missiles include China, France, India, Israel, Pakistan, Russia, and the United States. In the United States, a constellation of sensors and 36 interceptor missiles act as a GMD, or ground-based mid-course defense system. The idea is that as soon as a ballistic missile is launched, radar systems detect it, and sensors track the device and interceptor missiles fired once the nuclear missile leaves the atmosphere. But due to the problems mentioned about the difficulty hitting a nuclear missile in the early stages of deployment, we don't really know if this would work. Since 1999, the ground missile defense has been tested 18 times, but has never, thankfully, been tested under real-life conditions where the timing and location was not known in advance. Let's take a look at a potentially real scenario of North Korea launching a ballistic missile heading for the States. The device would be picked up by infrared satellite sensors that would detect the missile's path by following the heat signature as it launches from Earth. Once the rocket burns out, powerful radar will track the missile from below. If the target appears to be aired at the US, the aforementioned GMD is activated. The missile launched from North Korea would take about 30 minutes to reach the US mainland, and much of that period is spent outside the atmosphere. It is in this mid-course phase that the GMD would try and intercept. Up in space, the burned-out boosters detach and dismount, releasing the warhead. There could also be a cloud of debris and decoy devices implanted to confuse the interceptors. The military would launch 3 or 4 interceptors for each incoming threat to have a better chance of hitting the warhead among any decoys. Booster rockets burn out to reveal the kill vehicle. This is a new piece of technology designed to hunt down the warhead in space. The kill vehicle uses its sensors, along with the satellite guidance and an ultra-sensitive ground radar, to distinguish the warhead from other decoys and space junk and closes in on the missile's path and hopefully tracks it down before blasting it. Whether this is realistic defense strategy will hopefully not be tested, as most sane people can end international disputes diplomatically. And perhaps the best defense against nuclear Armageddon is the prospect of the devastating effect an all-out nuclear war will have on the world. This is perhaps the real reason no real attempt has been made, post-World War II, to initiate a nuclear attack campaign between nations so far in history.
The year is 1969, and North Korea has long been a thorn in the U.S.'s side. Backed up by the Soviet Union, North Korea's aggression toward the South is kept in check only by a very tight leash held by the Kremlin and the threat of American military response. However, the North Koreans chafe against the presence of Americans on the peninsula, the only roadblock in their quest to unite the two nations by force. In order to keep tabs on the communist bloc nations, the United States operates a reconnaissance program known as Beggar Shadow. The program uses spy aircraft flying safely over international waters and well away from the airspace of the nations they're monitoring. Yet, their powerful radars and eavesdropping technologies allow them to pick up communications between military units deep inside the hostile territory. At 7 a.m. on Tuesday, the 15th of April, 1969, an American EC-121M with the call sign Deep Sea 129 took off from Naval Air Station Atsugi in Japan and made for the Korean coast. Aboard it were 8 officers and 23 enlisted men, and their task was routine by now: loiter near the Korean coast and eavesdrop on North Korean communications. The flight route would take it within 50 miles of the Korean coast, where it would fly a racetrack-like route that would take it north near the Soviet Union's coast before turning back for Asan Air Base in South Korea. Rated as minimal risk, the mission had been carried out for 2 years without incident, and in the first 3 months of 1969, almost 200 similar missions had already been flown by the U.S. Navy and Air Force. This day, however, was different, and at 12:34 local time, 6 hours into the mission, radars in South Korea detected the takeoff of 2 North Korean MiG-21s. Assuming that they were responding to Deep Sea 129, the planes were tracked and the spy plane was warned. But being safely over international waters, it wasn't believed the plane was in danger. Then, suddenly, an hour after they took off, the jets made for Deep Sea 129 at what was clearly closing speed, and the American plane was warned. Deep Sea 129 immediately aborted its mission and returned to base, but the surprised North Korean jets quickly caught up with it. On radar, American operators watched as the 2 radar tracks merged, and then Deep Sea 129's track disappeared. Initially, none of the agencies involved were concerned, as protocol dictated that deep sea descend below radar coverage if threatened by hostile aircraft. Though these early model MiG-21s did not carry onboard radar, conditions allowed the MiG pilots to visually spot Deep Sea 129. Soon it became clear the North Koreans had downed the plane with an air-to-air missile. Immediately after the attack, North Korean military forces went into high readiness. Back in Washington, President Nixon and his staff received news of the attack. Nixon was furious, but more than that, he was drunk too. Aides had described Nixon as having developed bouts of insomnia and as having taken to drinking. He had begun to display extreme bouts of aggression, further fueled by his growing reliance on alcohol. And when he got the call that night that the North Koreans had downed an American plane flying over international waters, Nixon's anger grew to apocalyptic levels. 31 Americans were dead, and Nixon immediately got on the phone with the Joint Chiefs of Staff and ordered them to produce a list of targets for tactical nuclear strike. American nuclear bombers immediately went on standby as the Joint Chiefs drew up a list of recommendations for nuclear strikes deep inside North Korea. Within an hour, a list of targets were drawn up and sent to Henry Kissinger, Nixon's national security advisor, as American planes prepared to carry out what might be the opening shots of World War III. The targets listed gave Nixon 2 options: a series of attacks to serve as a punitive action against North Korea, or a full-blown nuclear attack that would crush the regime and prevent a large-scale war, mostly by leaving little of North Korea behind. The first list included 12 targets ranging from command centers to airfields and naval bases, and incredibly, despite the use of 12 10-kiloton nuclear weapons, would produce casualties as few as 100 to a few thousand. The second list, however, included the use of 70-kiloton nuclear weapons to destroy all of North Korea's major airfields as well as its command and control centers. Casualties would be in the tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands, though the vast majority of them would be military personnel. The Joint Chiefs of Staff were highly alarmed by Nixon's demand for a nuclear retaliation, as was Kissinger. If forced to carry out the attack, as Nixon had every legal right to do, the military warned that if they were going to strike with nuclear weapons, then they had best go all out and avoid the possibility of North Korea putting up much of a retaliation against forces in the South. This, of course, would immediately launch a war on the peninsula, but it was thought that North Korean forces would be so devastated they'd be able to offer little resistance. Launching on the first list of targets with the smaller-scale tactical nukes would only provoke North Korea into full-scale war, and with most of its forces intact. Yet, while North Korea could be utterly devastated in a surprise nuclear attack, the fallout, political and not just radiological, would be catastrophic for the United States. For the second time in history, the U.S. would launch a nuclear attack as an offensive measure, and this time it would utterly devastate an entire country in a surprise attack, a nuclear Pearl Harbor. This would completely destabilize relations with the Soviet Union and China both, and possibly prompt a nuclear response from the Russians. Even if there was no nuclear response from the Soviet Union, it would prove to the Soviets that a trigger-happy madman was in charge of things in the White House, and that nuclear war could be one drink away. This would make the careful system of checks and balances between the US and the Soviet Union that had so far averted nuclear conflict fall completely apart. Thankfully, Henry Kissinger postponed presenting the attack options to President Nixon until he had sobered up in the morning, by which time the prospect of launching a full-scale nuclear war seemed like a much less attractive option. Instead, the United States sent a task force led by the aircraft carriers Enterprise, Ticonderoga, Ranger, and Hornet to patrol off Korean waters and ensure the safety of all aircraft flying in the region. This would be the largest concentration of firepower in the region since the Korean War. For their part, the Soviet Union immediately dispatched 2 destroyers upon hearing of the downing of Deep Sea 129 in an effort to attempt to locate any surviving crew members and rescue them, or at the very least to secure the remains of the American airmen. The act was not just one of solidarity between the two Cold War rivals, but also meant to signal to Pyongyang how deeply displeased Moscow was with the shooting down of Deep Sea 129. The Mercedes-Maybach S600 sedan is a classy luxury vehicle. Sadly, such a vehicle is something I'll never afford on an infographics writer's salary. But you know who owns a pair of armored 2018 Mercedes-Maybach S600 sedans worth close to 500 grand each? North Korean dictator Kim Jong-un, and your bank might have helped him pay for them. Since the Korean War in the 1950s, there have been a few cycles of implementing and easing embargoes and sanctions on North Korea from the US and several other countries. In the last 15 years or so, each time North Korea conducts a nuclear weapons test or commits other infractions, the UN, EU, and several countries enact new sanctions. Currently, UN resolutions include banning North Korea from exporting gold, titanium, and rare earth materials, as well as coal, seafood, textiles, and lead. The EU also restricts elite North Korean citizens from purchasing luxury goods, traveling abroad, as well as targeting their financial assets and limiting banking transactions. Also, most importantly, sanctions prevent North Korea's import of weapons-related materials and petroleum products. But it's a cat-and-mouse game. North Korea is constantly attempting to find ways around sanctions, especially in regards to being able to build weapons. Kim Jong-un rules through fear and repression. He's extremely dependent on North Korea's nuclear program to showcase the military might of the country, not only to promote North Korea and intimidate other countries, but to maintain fear and patriotism in the hearts of his citizens. So how does North Korea funnel large sums of money into the weapons program? Are banks and other countries complicit in these schemes? New evidence reveals shocking ways North Korea funds its nuclear programs. Your bank could be involved. In the spring of 2020, the U.S. Justice Department pursued the agency's largest sanctions violation case ever. They indicted 28 North Korean and 5 Chinese citizens, alleging that they were behind an international money laundering enterprise. The clandestine web of fraud enabled over $2.5 billion in illegal payments from North Korea's nuclear weapons and missile program in violation of U.S. sanctions. Apparently, the 33 dependents operated out of several countries including Russia, China, Thailand, Libya, Austria, and Kuwait, running covert bank branches and more than 250 front companies to mask transactions and ultimately transfer funds to the Foreign Trade Bank, or FTB, North Korea's primary financial institution. The convoluted scheme had been running since 2013, when the U.S. Treasury Department Office of Foreign Assets Control sanctioned and blacklisted FTB from the U.S. financial system in an effort to directly limit North Korea's weapons building. Each covert branch or front company operated differently, depending on which country they were established in. The Justice Department is still untangling how some of the fraud maneuvers worked. So far, they've seized more than $63 million in laundered funds. Foreign financial institutions often maintain accounts in U.S. correspondent banks. Basically, correspondent banks support international wire transfers for foreign customers in currency that the foreign customer's local bank normally does not hold on reserve, such as U.S. dollars. This allows foreign entities to receive deposits, make payments or disbursements, and other transactions. FTB was blocked from using U.S. correspondent banks directly and indirectly. However, the secret banks and dummy companies hid the fact that the money originated from FTB. Therefore, correspondent banks processed payments they should have rejected. Front companies worth hundreds of thousands of dollars also made payments to U.S. companies with money that originated with the FTB. In addition to hiding the origins of money, North Korea had bypassed financial sanctions through offshore accounts, cryptocurrency hacks, and ransomware attacks. So in a real-world example, a North Korean hacker steals a couple million in bitcoins. The stolen bitcoin are sent through peel chains, or long chains of automated transfers to new addresses, with small bits and pieces of currency slowly peeled from the whole and sent to exchanges. Because the amount of sent bitcoin is small and comes from new or different accounts each time, the transactions don't trigger safeguards in place at the exchange, and the small bitcoin amounts are converted into hard currency. The hard currency ends up in the hands of a covert FTB branch, who obscures the money origins further and hands off the money to a correspondent bank. Via the correspondent bank, FTB is able to further transfer the money or use the laundered money to purchase legitimate goods or services. Remember Kim Jong-un's My Box? A private buyer backed by a front company or correspondent bank account might purchase the luxury goods, oil, or weapons materials. The purchased cargo is then shipped through a variety of freight forwarding companies in several different countries. Sooner or later, most likely, the cargo ends up on a merchant ship flying a flag of convenience, sailing in the Western Pacific. Often these ships have complicated or shady records which obscure ownership and origination of the vessel, which can cause jurisdiction problems if the ship is stopped. Mysteriously, the merchant ship turns off its transponder and can't be tracked for days, if not weeks, at sea. After delivering its cargo to a North Korean port and returning to the sea, the merchant ship transponder suddenly begins working again. Often, money laundering and the import of sanctioned goods by North Korea is able to happen because of complicit institutions or officials who, in the pursuit of making money, choose not to look too closely at the paperwork crossing their desks. This has been an ongoing issue with some South Korean and Chinese institutions. The spring bust by the U.S. Justice Department is only a drop in the bucket and has at least temporarily closed some loopholes for North Korea. Most likely, the majority of the defendants charged will never go to trial, as they have returned to North Korea or reside in other places where their chances of being extradited to the U.S. are low. Some U.S. officials believe that the best way to stop North Korea laundering money is to hit colluding institutions with millions in civil penalties or serious indictments. However, it's a delicate issue, and enacting an enormous penalty could damage U.S. relations with China and other countries. As long as North Korea is able to keep laundering money and funding its nuclear program, Kim Jong-un will proceed with missile testing. The U.S. Justice Department bust is only the tip of the iceberg. Will we be able to shut down North Korea's nuclear program before it's too late? And now that you reached the end of our video, why not keep the watch party going? Could we stop a nuclear missile from North Korea? Click here to find out. If you want to know more about how Kim Jong-un bypasses sanctions, click here.